They called him the Emperor of the Underworld, but his crown was forged in blood and betrayal. How does a man rise to command fear itself, only to spend his final nights haunted by the ghosts of every choice he made? Tonight, we talk about the quiet one. The boy who crossed oceans without a whisper, who watched more than he spoke, and learned early that silence could be sharper than a knife. Before he wore suits tailored in blood, before he sat at tables where kings bowed in disguise, he was just a child barefoot on the dusty hills outside Naples. His name was Vito, Vito Genovese. And if history remembers him at all, it remembers the echoes he left behind, not the footsteps he made. It started in the early 1900s, in a village that would not blink if you vanished. There were no playgrounds, just stone walls and hard hands. Vito's father worked the land, his mother held the home together with threadbare faith, and Vito he watched, not because he was scared, but because he understood early that listening got you further than shouting. When other boys threw rocks, he counted who threw first, who followed, and who smiled when no one was looking. He didn't just watch the game, he learned the rules behind it. By the time Vito turned 16, the family had scraped together enough lira to chase the American dream, though no one called it that back then. They just called it getting out. The boat was packed tight with hope and sweat, and by the time it docked in New York, Vito had already made up his mind. This new world didn't owe him anything, so he'd take what he needed and never ask twice. They settled in Manhattan, in the narrow streets of Little Italy, where accents echoed like old ghosts and the scent of garlic masked desperation. There, in that crowded maze of tenements and corner stoops, Vito found a new language: survival. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. The other kids laughed too loud. Vito didn't. He walked like a shadow that knew the sun wasn't permanent. In a city of noise, he was stillness. And in that stillness, opportunity found him. No one remembers the first time he broke the law. A stolen wallet, maybe. A lie told at the right moment. But it wasn't violence that marked him. It was precision. The way he moved. The way he nodded without smiling. It was Lucky Luciano who noticed him first. Noticed the way Vito leaned against a wall like he was already part of it. Lucky had vision. But Vito had patience, and that was more dangerous. So here he was, a boy from Naples with coal dust still in his lungs, standing in the greatest city in the world, watching it breathe like a wounded animal. And all he thought was, it bleeds like anything else. You just have to know where to press. Sleep tight. This story is only just beginning. The ship didn't bring dreams. It brought noise, sweat, the stink of salt and sickness, and the sound of 1,000 hopes cracking under waves. Vito Genovese stepped off that boat not with wonder in his eyes, but with hunger in his bones. Not just for food, though he hadn't eaten properly in days, but for something else, something he couldn't name yet. A place at the table. A seat in a world that didn't notice boys like him until it was too late. It was the year 1913, and the Genovese family had arrived in New York with nothing but a surname, a few coins, and the kind of grit that got passed down when you had no choice. The city didn't open its arms. It sneered. It smelled like coal smoke and steam, and it moved faster than anything Vito had ever seen. Horses clattered down crowded streets. Newsboys shouted headlines like war cries. And above it all, the skyline stabbed upward like ambition trying to claw its way out of the earth. They settled in Little Italy, because that's where everyone like them went. Tenements stacked like coffins, walls thin enough to hear your neighbor's cough become a prayer. The hallways always smelled of boiled onions and old sweat. But it wasn't poverty that got to Vito, it was the noise. Constant, scraping, yelling, everyone trying to be heard, to prove they mattered. Vito didn't. He kept quiet, kept watching. His eyes were always open, always calculating. Because if the world was a machine, he intended to learn every gear. He was just a teenager, but already, His spine was straight like a man who understood what bending cost. At night, when other boys dreamed of baseball or the flicker of Nickelodeon screens, Vito thought about numbers. Who owed who got paid, who was afraid of what. In the alleys and butcher shops, he learned that power wasn't loud. It was in the nods, the silences. The men who didn't need to shout because their names already whispered in someone else's ear. He got work where he could. Lifting crates, sweeping floors, running errands, but always watching, always waiting. A quiet boy with old eyes and a mouth that stayed shut unless it had something sharp to say. It wasn't long before those errands started leading him to places where knives were cleaner than the money, where favors meant debts, and debts meant control. He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, because Vito Genovese wasn't afraid of dirt. He was afraid of being forgotten. That was the hunger. Not for bread, not for safety, but for the kind of power that made the world remember your name long after you stopped saying it. Sleep now. Tomorrow, the boy becomes something else. The streets didn't care where you came from. They didn't care if you were hungry or holy or trying your best. They taught their lessons hard and fast. And if you didn't learn, they left you broken in the gutter while someone else stepped over your body. Little Italy in the 19-teens was no place for slow learners, and Vito Genovese never had that problem. He learned quick, quiet, and he remembered everything. You could smell the danger long before you saw it. The burnt coffee from a backroom cafe, the blood on a fishmonger's apron that didn't come from fish, the way certain men tipped their hats and others didn't. It was a code, a language written in glances, in debts, in the weight of a stare held 1 second too long. Most kids tried to survive it. Vito studied it, memorized it, made it his own. He saw early how fear worked. Not the loud kind, not the kind with fists and shouting. That kind faded. No, the fear that mattered lived in silence, in the way a shopkeeper's hand trembled when he handed over the envelope, in the way mothers pulled their children close when a black sedan slowed near the curb. Vito didn't flinch at any of it. He watched, absorbed. The world was sharpening him like a blade it knew it would one day use. He wasn't in school much, not the kind with desks and chalkboards. His classroom was the street corner, the stoop, the shadowy doorway of a butcher shop where men talked low and laughed less. He ran errands for men who didn't have real jobs but always had new suits, and every time he came back on time, with the right package and the right silence, they looked at him a little differently, not like a kid, like someone who could be useful. The beatings came too, not from his family, from life, fists in alleys, knees to the ribs, the price of learning who not to cross and when not to speak. He took it, didn't cry, didn't break, just filed it away. A lesson. Every bruise a page in a book he was writing for a future only he could see. And when he hit back because eventually, he made sure it only had to happen once. By the time Vito was in his late teens, people knew. They didn't say it out loud, but they knew. The boy wasn't just surviving. He was calculating, building something beneath the surface. And one day, he'd own more than just fear. He'd own the men who used it. Close your eyes now. The street taught him well. But what he builds next, that's where the real story begins. It wasn't fireworks. No gunshots, no oaths, no grand promises under street lamps. It was quieter than that. Like most real beginnings are, just a nod, a favor, and a look that said more than a handshake ever could. Vito met Lucky Luciano not in some smoky back room with blood on the floor, but on the street where power first learns to walk before it learns to run. And when they looked at each other, they both saw the same thing. Someone who could finish what the other started. Lucky was already rising. Sharp suits, sharper mind. He wasn't loud, but when he walked into a room, the noise adjusted to fit him. Vito didn't chase him. He wasn't the type. He circled instead, ran jobs, watched him, let others talk. It was Lucky who made the first real move, a test, a small task, something most kids would brag about. Vito didn't. He just did it. No questions, no delay. And that was all Lucky needed to see. They were different, but not in ways that mattered. Lucky had charm, Vito had gravity. One pulled people in, the other made them stay afraid. Together, they didn't need words. They understood the world in the same cold, mechanical way. Loyalty wasn't emotional, it was useful. Trust wasn't friendship, it was insurance. And betrayal wasn't shocking, it was expected. But between the two of them, there was none of that. Not yet, not then. Vito became something like a shadow for Lucky. Not a sidekick, not a soldier. Something quieter. He made problems disappear. People too. But he never asked for credit. Never tried to outshine the star. That's what made him dangerous. Most men wanted to be seen. Vito wanted to be obeyed. And Lucky, to his credit, understood the value of keeping a man like that close and closer still when things started to shift. This was the beginning of something larger. Not just for them, but for the city, for the country. The old guard, the mustache Petey's and their dusty codes were starting to crack. And these two boys, one with charm and one with eyes like stone, were ready to build something new. Not for honor, for control, for profit, for a kind of power that outlived memory. People say Lucky built the modern mafia. That's only half true. He designed it. But Vito Genovese made sure it had teeth, made sure it bit, and once it tasted blood, it never stopped. So sleep now. The partnership is forged, and somewhere in the dark, the blueprint for an empire is being drawn by candlelight. Most men rush. They swing too early, speak too soon, pull the trigger before they understand the weight of what dies when the bullet lands. But not Vito. Vito Genovese moved like cold water, slow, quiet, and patient enough to wear down stone. He understood something most gangsters never learned. Power doesn't come from action. It comes from knowing when to act. He'd stand on the corner for hours without saying a word, just watching, not out of boredom, not because he had nothing to do, but because everything he needed to know was right there in the way someone lit a cigarette, in the twitch of a shopkeeper's eye when certain names were spoken. The city breathed secrets. Vito just learned how to listen. He studied the men above him, not to imitate them but to find their weaknesses. Lucky was a mentor, yes, but even mentors cast shadows. Vito stayed just outside that light, learning how deals were made, how enemies were broken with smiles, and how a favor could be a leash in disguise. He said little, did what he was told, and quietly kept a list in his head of who could be trusted and who needed to disappear one day. In those years, Vito wasn't flashy. He let others take the spotlight, let them feel important, let them think he was just another reliable pair of hands. But inside, he was building something far more dangerous than a reputation. He was building vision, not for the next job or the next week, but for the next decade, the long game, the real game. He watched as the old Italians clung to their fading rituals, blood oaths, family names, codes from a world that didn't understand skyscrapers and telephones. And while the others bowed to tradition, Vito saw what was coming, a future shaped by business, not blood, by networks, not neighborhoods, by silence, not ceremony. The new world wouldn't need heroes. It would need architects, and he would be one of them. There's a reason snakes don't roar. A reason the sharpest blade is the one you don't see. Vito didn't chase power. He let it wander close, like a tired animal. And when it finally lay down beside him, he didn't flinch, just reached out and took it. So, rest your eyes. Let the city fade. Somewhere in the shadows, a man is watching. And when he finally decides to move, the world will shift around him and never shift back. It always starts with one body, one decision, one moment where a man stops being who he was and becomes who he's willing to be. For Vito Genovese, that moment didn't come with fanfare. No headlines, no echoing gunfire, just a quiet job, a short drive, and a name that needed to disappear. And when it was done, Vito didn't blink, because First Blood was never about the killing, it was about what came after. The target was small time, a problem, not a threat, but a message needed sending, and Lucky wanted to see if the quiet boy from Naples could speak violence fluently. Vito didn't hesitate. He asked no questions, made no excuses. He just showed up at the edge of the city with cold eyes and steadier hands. When the man begged, Vito didn't flinch. When it was over, he didn't run. He just wiped the handle clean and walked back into the night like it was any other. That was the difference. Other men tried to prove something. Vito didn't. He didn't need approval. He needed results. And from that first drop of blood, power began to gather around him like iron filings to a magnet. Not loud, not fast, just steady, relentless. A quiet storm building in a world that only understood thunder after it cracked. The body was found in a ditch. No witnesses, no evidence, just fear. That was the real currency. And soon, word got around. Not about the name of the man who did it, but about the fact that someone out there could kill like that, efficient, clean, unbothered. That's what drew the real attention. That's what opened doors usually locked with bloodlines and bribes. Vito had walked through them without saying a word. Lucky gave him more work after that. Not because Vito enjoyed it, but because he didn't. Because he treated death like business. No rage, no chaos, just necessity. And that terrified the ones who still believed in rules, in codes, in boundaries. Vito understood early those things were myths, tools for the weak to hold the strong in place, and he would not be held. With that first kill, he wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was something else, something colder. Men started looking over their shoulders when his name was whispered, not because they feared noise, but because they feared silence. The kind that comes before something breaks. So now you know, it only takes one. And for Vito, that first time wasn't a step, it was a signal. That he was ready, that he wouldn't blink, that from this moment forward, every drop of blood would mean progress. Sleep now. The quiet boy just got loud in the only language that mattered. Vito understood something long before most men ever did. Power isn't always taken with bullets. Sometimes it wears a sash, gives speeches, and shakes hands with popes. And in the years when the old world began boiling with flags and fists, Vito Genovese didn't just watch the rise of Benito Mussolini. He studied it, admired it, whispered to himself that this was what true control looked like. Not a street corner, not a racket, but a nation kneeling to one man's name. The 1920s were shifting. In America, the mob was still learning to walk in tailored suits. But back in Italy, Mussolini had already marched on Rome, had already bent a country around his will like a man reshaping hot iron. And Vito, with one foot still in the old country and the other planted in New York, felt the pull, not of politics, of structure, of a machine that punished weakness and rewarded obedience. He didn't care about speeches or black shirts. What caught his eye was how Mussolini took chaos and caged it, how he broke the old codes and wrote his own. That resonated, because Vito had always believed the old codes were lies, romantic dust for fools to choke on. And here was a man, an entire system proving him right. Some nights, Vito would sit in a cafe on Mulberry Street, espresso cooling beside him, reading translated newspapers about fascist reforms, purges, and propaganda, and he wouldn't smile. Just absorb, measure, compare. The mafia had bosses, but Mussolini? Mussolini had loyalty branded into bone. That wasn't leadership, that was empire. By the time the 30s arrived, the admiration was no longer distant. Vito began aligning himself with men who whispered fascist sympathies in broken English. Not for ideology, for opportunity. He saw that lines were being drawn, that the future would belong not to the loudest, but to those who knew how to ride the storm without being noticed until it was over. People think Vito wanted to be lucky, that he wanted to run a family, wear rings, sit in smoky rooms playing king. But no, Vito didn't want a seat at the table. He wanted the table burned down and rebuilt in his image. And Mussolini showed him how. The shadow of the dictator stretched across oceans. And Vito walked inside that shadow like it was shelter, like it was a mirror, not of who he was, but of what he could become. So, sleep now. The quiet boy from Naples is learning from tyrants now. And tomorrow, the rules will change. Because Vito doesn't believe in following orders. He believes in giving them. The old ways were dying, slowly at first, like an engine coughing smoke before it gives out completely. The Black Hand, with its scrawled threats and blood-stained letters, once ruled the immigrant fear. It lived in dark hallways and crude violence, in the cracking of bones and the whisper of knives. But the world was changing, and so was the mob. Vito Genovese saw it before most. The old world stank of desperation. The new one? It wore silk, carried ledgers, and knew how to smile while it robbed you blind. In the early 1920s, the shift began. No more kidnappings for a few crumpled bills. No more throwing acid for insult. Now it was bootleg liquor by the truckload. Numbers, rackets dressed up like businesses. Politicians bought wholesale, not just bribed at the back door. It was Lucky Luciano who led the evolution. But it was men like Vito who enforced it. Men who didn't just play the new game, but rewrote the rules. The suits got sharper. The operations got cleaner. And suddenly, what had once been seen as street scum became an empire. They called it La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours. Not for pride, for protection. Because the more legitimate they looked, the harder it became for the law to touch them. And Vito? He slipped into this new skin, like it had been stitched just for him. He never had time for the old rituals. The mustache Petties with their talk of honor and Sicilian codes. He saw their stubbornness for what it was, weakness dressed in tradition. While they bowed to ghosts, Vito counted profits. While they insisted on being feared, he made himself useful. He didn't demand respect. He bought it, leased it, owned it in silence. It was in this climate that Vito began his real rise. Not through blood, through structure, through the careful placing of men like chess pieces, through deals sealed with silence, not gunfire. He didn't want headlines. He wanted leverage. And soon, he had it in ports, in unions, in courts, the kind of power that made judges forget, witnesses vanish, and enemies wonder when their last safe day had already passed. This was not the mafia of postcards and knives in the dark. This was a corporation built on fear, loyalty, and quiet ambition. And in that new world, Vito was not a thug. He was an executive, a strategist, a man with one foot in the shadows and the other in a boardroom no one knew existed. So drift off now. The old world is gone, and the boy who once watched from stoops now sits at the helm of a growing empire, wearing black suits instead of black threats, but wielding something far more dangerous than a blade. He wields tomorrow. It didn't happen with a ceremony. There was no oath, no toast, no candle-lit moment under a cross. Just a job, done clean, then another, then another. And before long, Vito Genovese wasn't just Lucky Luciano's associate. He was his enforcer, not the loudest, not the flashiest, but the one you sent when it absolutely had to be done right, or done forever. By the mid-1920s, Lucky was moving fast, too fast for the old ways to keep up. He was reshaping the mafia from a tangled mess of warring clans into something leaner, meaner, and smarter. He didn't want tradition. He wanted efficiency. And that meant he needed men around him who could deliver without dragging ghosts behind them. That meant Vito. Vito didn't kick down doors. He didn't need to. He walked in through the front, looked a man in the eyes, and made him understand what would happen if he said the wrong word. He was the kind of enforcer who didn't waste time with threats. He simply explained consequences softly, directly, and left the silence to do the rest. That's what Lucky loved. Not just the muscle, the method, Where others used fear like a club, Vito wielded it like a scalpel. He broke unions, settled debts, and made sure the Luciano name carried weight in every corner of the city without ever needing to shout. And when blood was necessary, and sometimes it was, he didn't flinch, didn't blink, just got it done, then ordered a coffee, like it was Tuesday morning. The real power, though, wasn't in what he did. It was in how he did it. Quiet, controlled, calculated. He never let emotion cloud his judgment. He never let loyalty turn into blindness. And because of that, Lucky began trusting him with more than just punishment. He trusted him with planning, with strategy, with the kind of decisions that shaped the very bones of what would become the commission. See? While the newspapers focused on the blood and the bodies, Vito and Lucky were building something bigger, a structure, a government of crime. And as Lucky crafted the design, Vito hammered it into place with every silent job, every cold call, every man who disappeared without a trace and left behind a lesson no one would forget. He wasn't just enforcing orders, he was enforcing order. And in the new mafia, one built on profit instead of pride, Vito Genovese was more than just muscle. He was proof that silence could be louder than any gunshot. So now, close your eyes. Imagine a man in the back of the room, arms folded, watching everything, missing nothing. That's Vito. And if he stands, if he walks toward you, it means the decision's already been made. The city was a mess of blood and ambition. Turf wars cracked like thunder across boroughs. Old bosses clung to old grudges, and every corner had its own king until Lucky Luciano decided it was time for a new world. Not just cleaner, organized. And standing beside him, silent but steady, was Vito Genovese, already proving he wasn't just a tool of power. He was part of its design. It didn't happen overnight. It took years of betrayal, bullets, and backroom deals to sweep away the old men, choking the life out of the future. But when the dust cleared, what remained was something no one had seen before: a blueprint, a system. 5 families, each one sovereign in its own domain, but bound together by something stronger than blood: the commission. Lucky gave the families their names, their seats, their rules. But Vito was the one who made sure those rules were followed when words failed. He didn't speak in threats. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. When the bosses met, he was there, listening more than talking, watching more than moving. And when things went quiet after a disagreement, it was often Vito who made it so. He was Luciano's choice to stand at the center of the Genovese family, though it wasn't called that yet. Not officially. That would come later, but everyone already knew. He wasn't just one of Lucky's men. He was one of the men. A pillar. A voice in the room that mattered more than most. The 5 families weren't just gangs anymore. They became corporations with blood-stained ledgers. Luciano, Genovese, Mangano, Bonanno, and Profaci. 5 names, 5 empires. And underneath it all, Vito was setting foundations deeper than concrete. His reach went into unions, docks, construction, politics. Not flashy, not loud, just endless, just patient. And while others craved the spotlight, Vito made power feel like gravity, unseen but impossible to escape. He understood that true strength wasn't in being feared. It was in being expected. In being the man everyone turned to when balance tipped too far and someone had to disappear quietly so business could go on. This was not the mafia of old. This was not vendetta. This was empire. And Vito Genovese wasn't just a brick in the wall. He was mortar holding it all together, one cold, calculated decision at a time. Now sleep easy. The chaos has been tamed. The old gods have fallen. And in the quiet that follows, a new order has risen, built by men who smiled in silence and made the city theirs. One of those men is already dreaming of a throne of his own. His name is Vito, and he's not done yet. They called it murder. Incorporated, like it was a business, because that's exactly what it was. An outsourced death squad, efficient, untraceable, and terrifyingly effective. Based in Brooklyn, run by Jewish and Italian killers who didn't ask questions, only took contracts. And for a man like Vito Genovese, it was a dream come true. A knife you didn't have to hold. A bullet you didn't have to fire. Just a name passed in silence, and a problem erased. While the newspapers screamed about mob hits and gangland executions, Vito watched calmly from behind the curtain, because he knew something they didn't need to get its hands dirty. Not when there were professionals eager to do it for you. And Murder Incorporated was the perfect tool for a man like him. Quiet, efficient, deadly without emotion, exactly his language. Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky had built it to enforce the new rules of the commission. No more freelance killing, no more emotional decisions. If someone had to go, it went through the chain. And when approval came down, the boys from Brooklyn handled it. Ice picks, pistols, or just a vanished body no one would ever find. Vito didn't use them often, but when he did, it meant something. He reserved their services for moments that demanded absolute silence. No leaks, no whispers, just resolution. And the men they sent? Albert Anastasia, Louis Lepke. Names that made grown men sweat through their collars. Vito didn't fraternize with them. He didn't have to. He just made sure the money flowed and the instructions were clear. He understood the beauty of the system. It kept the families clean. It kept the books balanced. It turned murder from an act of passion into an act of management. And Vito, always the strategist, used that to his advantage. He could order death without drawing heat, could move pieces off the board while pretending he never touched them. Some of his rivals never saw it coming. They thought Vito was too quiet, too old school, too distant to play the new games, until they were found face down in their soup, or not found at all. And by then, Vito had already moved on to his next meeting, his next deal, his next step toward the throne. Sleep now. Somewhere in the city, a name has just been whispered in a back room, and someone is already getting into a car with a pistol tucked under his coat. He doesn't know who gave the order. He doesn't care. But if you trace the silence long enough, if you listen close enough, you'll hear Vito's voice at the end of it. Not shouting, just deciding. It was not a gunfight. It was not a war. It was a whisper, followed by silence, and in that silence, an empire shifted. Salvatore Maranzano had declared himself the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. But in doing so, he forgot one simple truth. Men like Vito Genovese and Lucky Luciano did not serve crowns. They broke them. The night the old world died did not begin with violence. It began with a meeting. Maranzano, sharp-suited and proud, summoned Luciano to his office under the pretense of order. He wanted to tighten the reins, remind the younger generation who still held the strings. But Lucky knew better. He smelled the trap before it closed, and in response, he didn't raise his voice. He raised the stakes. Vito Genovese was there for the planning. Not front and center, never that, but close enough to see the outline of what needed to happen. The plan was elegant. No drama, just precision. A few men dressed as federal agents entered Maranzano's office on Park Avenue. They didn't speak much, just moved fast. Knives, not bullets. Close, personal. Because this wasn't just about removing a man, it was about ending an era. When Maranzano collapsed in a pool of his own blood, the old mafia died with him. The mustache petties, the outdated codes, the backwater rituals clinging to Sicily like a ghost that refused to fade. All of it ended in that quiet office, on that sharp autumn night in 1931. And while the city held its breath, Vito moved through the silence like a man finally stepping into daylight. He had helped orchestrate the fall of a king without ever drawing his own blade. That was his style. That was his strength. Let others be loud. He would be final. In the days that followed, the 5 families were solidified. The commission was formed, and a new kind of power settled over New York, not bound by heritage or tradition, but by money, strategy, and the cold logic of men like Vito Genovese. Men who knew that to build something lasting, You first had to bury the past. Sleep easy now. The old gods have been put to rest, their names carved into stone, their rules folded and burned, and in the smoke that rose from their ashes, Vito stood taller not as a servant of a throne, but as a man already building one of his own. Patience is a weapon most men never learn to sharpen, but Vito Genovese wasn't most men. While others burned fast and bright, clawing for control, chasing headlines, Vito did something rare in the world of gangsters. He waited, not because he was timid, not because he lacked the will, but because he understood something dangerous. Power taken too early never lasts. Power earned in silence becomes permanent. After the fall of Maranzano and the rise of the Commission, the landscape changed. Lucky Luciano sat at the center of it all, a young king carving out a modern empire, and there Vito was near the throne, but not on it, close enough to taste it, but wise enough not to reach, not yet. The truth was, he didn't need the crown, not while the real game was still unfolding. Vito watched, he built, he fortified, he expanded his reach quietly into the ports, the unions, the construction crews laying bricks for buildings they'd never own. He didn't posture, he didn't boast, he studied the men around him who was loyal, who was loud, who could be bought, and who would beg when the tables turned. Even as Lucky grew into legend, Vito kept his movements minimal. He knew the eyes of the world were on Luciano now. The press, the police, the politicians, they all saw Lucky as the face. And that suited Vito just fine, because shadows are where roots grow deep, and his roots were spreading far beneath the surface. There were times when others questioned him, called him too careful, too slow, but Vito didn't flinch. He understood cycles, knew that in their world, glory faded quick, but the quiet ones, the ones who outlasted the storm, they became permanent. He wasn't here to make a splash. He was here to flood the room when the time was right. Even Lucky noticed. He once said Vito was like a coiled spring, never wasting energy, just waiting to strike. And he was right, because deep down, Vito never stopped calculating, never stopped planning. And every favor earned, every deal brokered, every whisper exchanged in backrooms was another stone in the foundation he was laying. So rest now. The loud men are dancing in the lights, but there's one in the corner, sipping quietly, nodding slowly. He's not clapping, he's counting, waiting, smiling just enough to stay invited, because Vito Genovese already knows the music will stop, and when it does, he won't need to scramble for a chair. He'll already be sitting in one. They called it progress. They called it unity. The commission was meant to be the end of blood feuds, the answer to chaos. A table where all the bosses sat equal, where business came before ego, and decisions were carved in agreement instead of bullets. And on the surface, it worked. Territories were drawn. Disputes were settled. The 5 families thrived. But Vito Genovese looked at that table and saw something else. He saw weakness wearing a suit. The commission was Lucky's vision. A round table of equals, but only one voice really mattered, his. He believed order could be kept through structure, that rules could tame men who made their fortunes breaking them. Vito disagreed, quietly, always quietly. He saw rules as cages, and if you let others write them, you were just decorating your own prison. So Vito played along, sat in meetings, nodded at the right moments, voted when votes were called. But inside, the plan was already forming. Not to destroy the commission, no. That would be foolish. The world needed it now. But to control it, to hollow it out and wear its skin. Because if all bosses were equal, the man who whispered loudest could become more equal than the rest. He started small, sowed doubts in whispers, pushed quiet influence into smaller families, made favors feel like friendships, and friendships feel like debts. He didn't challenge Lucky directly. That would have been suicide. Instead, he undermined him with patience like water beneath a stone, soft but relentless. Others missed it. They were too busy enjoying their cut, too too drunk on the new peace to notice that Vito was building something inside the walls. Not a rebellion, a replacement. A world where he didn't share power, he distributed it. Where decisions weren't voted on, they were expected. The commission was a symbol of the future. But Vito Genovese was a man of empires, not councils. He didn't believe in balance. He believed in gravity, and eventually, everything falls toward the strongest pull. So sleep now, while the table still holds, while the names are still spoken with reverence. But remember, every king who shares his crown is already losing it. And in the shadows of that commission room, one man watches the others grow soft, waiting for them to forget who sharpened the blade they all pretend not to see. His name is Vito. And he didn't come to sit at the table. He came to flip it. Exile to Italy. The law had always circled, but now it was closing in. Not the beat cops you could buy with a handshake and a brown envelope. This was federal. Serious. The kind of attention that made even kings reconsider their crowns. Luciano was the first to feel it. The charges came fast: prostitution, conspiracy, a courtroom circus with headlines that didn't stop. And just like that, the face of the commission was gone, sentenced and shipped off. It rattled the whole structure. But not Vito. Vito Genovese didn't panic. He calculated, watched the tremors, listened to the air between conversations. He saw what others missed. The rules had changed. The streets were still theirs, but the cameras, the courtrooms, the press, they belonged to someone else now. Men were being watched like never before, and in a world of whispers, silence became a survival tactic. So he made a choice: disappear. In 1937, with a quiet farewell and no fanfare, Vito booked a voyage back to Naples. Not in fear, in strategy. Let them look for him in the alleyways of Brooklyn while he dined in Italian courtyards. Let the commission bicker without him while he rebuilt in the old country. It wasn't surrender. It was positioning. Because Vito knew something the others didn't. Sometimes you win more by not being in the room. He had roots in Italy, contacts, history. Mussolini's rise had reshaped the underworld there too, but Vito adapted. He moved between the shadows of fascism and opportunity like a man born to it. And across the ocean, his legend grew stranger. Some said he'd abandoned America. Others claimed he ran Europe now. The truth lived somewhere in between, but what mattered was this: he was alive, untouched, and watching. Meanwhile, back in New York, his enemies breathed easier. They thought maybe he was done, that maybe the quiet one had finally faded into memory. But Vito was never gone, just waiting again, watching again, letting the pressure build, because every man has his season. And Vito Genovese wasn't done writing his. So close your eyes tonight, knowing this. While the law brags about the ones it catches, the smart ones slip beneath the surface. And down there, in that deep silence, one man watches the game reset itself. His name is Vito. And he's not hiding, he's preparing. In the hills outside Naples sat a quiet estate with tall gates and taller roomers. They called it Villa Genovese, but it was more than a home. It was a fortress with flower beds, a command post disguised as luxury. And within its walls, Vito Genovese orchestrated his return not just to America, but to power itself. No need for headlines, just letters, favors, and conversations that never left the room. From this sun-drenched distance, Vito pulled strings like a puppeteer who had memorized every thread. He made alliances with men the American press had never heard of. He traded in influence, in war-scarred desperation, in the kind of favors that never expire. His money moved quietly, feeding both the black market and official channels: weapons, oil, narcotics, even information. He learned that chaos makes a fine business partner, as long as you're the one handing out the chaos. And all the while, his legend grew. In Brooklyn, his name became a whisper again. The man who left, the one they couldn't indict, the one who might never come back, but if he did, everything would change. The truth was, Vito never left the business. He just changed where he ran it from. While other bosses jostled for scraps, he hosted dinners with ex-generals and police chiefs who owed him more than loyalty. He wasn't hiding from the law. He was gathering leverage, one handshake at a time. Every letter he sent back to New York was like a coin dropped in a well, a slow echo that eventually came back up with results. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but his reach? It stretched from the port of Naples to the docks of Manhattan like a current beneath the Atlantic. Even Mussolini's regime, brutal, suspicious, unforgiving, left him alone, because Vito understood power in all its forms. He didn't challenge it. He learned from it, studied how it moved, and more importantly, how it fell. At Villa Genovese, every night ended the same way. Vito on the balcony, staring into the distance with a drink in hand, the sky soft above him, not thinking of escape, not thinking of regret. Just measuring time, measuring who still ruled, who had fallen, and when it would be right to return. So drift off tonight knowing this power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits behind stone walls and iron gates, surrounded by roses, and when it's ready, it doesn't knock. It simply walks back in, like it never left. War doesn't just shift borders, it exposes loyalties. And in the chaos of Mussolini's Italy, Vito Genovese became something few gangsters ever dreamed of, useful to a dictator. While Allied forces stormed beaches and resistance fighters plotted in shadows, Vito sat in Naples, not just watching history unfold, but shaping tiny parts of it, not with a gun, with favors. Mussolini's regime, drowning in fear and corruption, found itself needing men like Vito, men who could move goods, quiet problems, and make things appear where none should. Black market operations flourished under his guidance. Weapons, fuel, rationed goods, all slipped through hands greased by desperation and fear. And Vito, he profited, not just in money, but in silence, in leverage. He played both sides, smiled at fascists while feeding information to the Americans. And when the war turned and Mussolini's grip began to crumble, Vito adjusted like a man changing coats in a storm. There's no loyalty in business, only opportunity. And Vito made sure his name was written in ink on both ledgers. But power has a price. There were whispers about executions, about stolen art, about bodies buried in fields no map marked, men who disappeared after meetings with Vito's associates, Italians who defied the regime and were never seen again. Did he give the orders? Did he simply look away? No one knows. And that was the point. When the Allies rolled into Naples, they found a city broken but functioning, and right in the middle of it all, dressed sharply and ready, was Vito Genovese, not as a fugitive, not as a gangster, but as a man offering help, guidance, translation, resources, a man who could smooth the transition, a man the U.S. military, shockingly, found useful. For a while, he even worked as an interpreter for the American army. Imagine that, one of the most feared mobsters in New York, now helping direct traffic and draft supply routes under a new flag. But beneath the calm voice and respectful nods, the old machine still turned. The profits still flowed, and the bodies still vanished when they needed to. He helped Mussolini's machine when it served him. He helped the Americans when they needed him. And through it all, his hands stayed just clean enough to shake with power. So sleep now. And remember this, some men don't wear sides like uniforms. They wear them like masks. And when one slips, another is ready underneath. Vito Genovese never picked a side in the war. He picked himself. And in the end, that was the only side that ever won. They called him a translator, but he moved like a general. In occupied Naples, Vito Genovese walked beside American officers with a calm authority that didn't match his job title. Civilians saluted him. Soldiers followed his suggestions without question. To some, he was just helping rebuild a broken city. To others, He looked suspiciously comfortable giving orders in a war zone. Either way, Vito didn't care. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. This was a new kind of boss, not the street tough in back alleys with a cigar and a sneer. Vito wore suits, pressed sharp, and smiled for the camera. He stood next to generals and posed as a civic helper. He shook hands with men who didn't know or pretended not to know how many bodies had vanished in his name. He was given medals for assistance. Medals for a man who once ran heroin through the Bronx. But war is strange. It scrambles definitions. If a man can move supplies, calm neighborhoods, and keep the trains running on time, suddenly, the past becomes foggy, and Vito was a master at fog. He made himself indispensable, both to the Americans rebuilding and to the locals trying to survive. He set up networks of trade, smuggled necessities, calmed rival factions. On paper, it looked like community leadership. In reality, it was control. Old-school mafia power, dressed in military cooperation. There were whispers, of course. Soldiers murmured about his influence. Some officers warned he was too connected, too clever. But by then, it was too late. Vito had embedded himself so deeply into the post-war machinery that removing him would have caused more chaos than keeping him close. And so, they let him stay, let him rise. To those who had known him back in New York, the transformation was staggering. The kid from Naples, who once shined shoes on Mulberry Street, now operated like a diplomat. But nothing about Vito had really changed. He still believed in dominance, in loyalty paid in blood, in silence enforced with fear. He had simply learned how to make it look respectable. And when the medals were pinned on his chest, when the photographers clicked their shutters, when the brass said his name aloud in thanks, Vito Genovese stood still, calm, knowing something they didn't, that every empire, no matter how noble, still runs on shadows. So as you drift off tonight, picture this: a man once hunted by the law, now celebrated by it. Not because he changed, but because the world did. And in that brief window between war and peace, Vito stepped forward, not as a fugitive, but as a man reborn. Not with a gun, with a ribbon. Power doesn't always need a throne. Sometimes it just needs time. And in those quiet years abroad, Vito Genovese learned something the streets of New York could never teach: how to rule without lifting a hand. From his villa outside Naples, the exile became an architect of shadows. He wasn't just waiting to return, he was planning how to walk back into his kingdom like he never left. Every letter he sent was a thread. Every smuggled message, a stitch in a tapestry no one else could see. His contacts back home stayed loyal, not because they feared him, though many still did, but because they remembered. They remembered the way he watched, the way he moved, the way people disappeared without warning. The longer he stayed away, the more mythic he became. The other bosses had started to squabble. Without Lucky holding the commission's reins tight, cracks were forming. Ambition leaked through. Scores resurfaced. Blood debts started to boil again. And somewhere across the Atlantic, Vito heard it all, listened, took notes, and smiled. A kingdom divided was a kingdom ripe for return. He started sending instructions again. Quiet ones, strategic ones. He didn't demand territory. He suggested alliances. He didn't bark orders. He offered favors. And through it all, his influence grew. Men he hadn't seen in a decade still bowed to his name, because Vito had learned something most gangsters never live long enough to understand. Fear fades. But respect, if built right, can stretch across oceans. In time, he stopped pretending to be small. He hosted dinners with men who wore medals and uniforms. He bought property that screamed permanence. He whispered to both sides of the war while playing the long game. And every once in a while, late at night, he'd run a hand along the old maps, not of Italy, of New York. He hadn't just survived exile. He had thrived in it, grown in it, became something larger than the man who had once walked Mulberry Street with a pocket knife and ambition. He became an idea, and ideas are hard to kill. So, rest easy now. Knowing this, some men vanished to be forgotten, others vanished to become unforgettable. And Vito Genovese, the man who once cleaned blood from his own cuffs, was no longer just a gangster. He was an empire waiting to be restored. Not through war, not through fire, but through return, quiet, inevitable. Just like him, they whispered his name in 2 languages. In English, it carried weight. In Italian, it carried fear. Vito Genovese Naples knew the face, but not the whole story. To the locals, he was the polite American with deep pockets and deeper eyes. But behind the charm and the tailored suits, the truth lingered like smoke. This wasn't just another exile riding out the war. This was a man who made dictators nervous and generals shake his hand anyway. In post-war Italy, Vito was something different. Not a foreigner, not a native, something in between. He walked the crumbling streets with an American stride and Sicilian patience. He understood how power moved in Italy because he had studied it under Mussolini, then outlived it. He saw where the black market fed the starving and where loyalty bent to hunger, and he made sure he stood at the center of both. The locals called him l'Americano, but that was too soft. He wasn't just another man who fled New York's heat. He was building something new, an empire that could stretch from Sicily to the South Bronx. Smuggling routes, political favors, military connections. Even the Vatican's silence felt like it had a price tag. And Vito? He had the coins to pay it. The American military, for a while, considered him an asset. He spoke the language, knew the players, helped stabilize the region. But in every favor he offered, a hook was buried. By the time they realized, it was too late. He wasn't working for them. He was using them. Every uniformed officer who shook his hand helped launder a little more blood from his reputation. Even the Italian press danced around him. Stories would vanish. Reporters backed off. Judges hesitated, because no one wanted to be the first to learn what happened when you crossed the man who made Mussolini look like a temporary problem. There were quiet deaths, men found in alleys, women who swore he was involved in something far darker than business, but no evidence ever stuck. Vito didn't leave trails. He left impressions, and those were harder to erase. In Italy, Vito Genovese became something more dangerous than a fugitive. He became legitimate. At least, that's how it looked on paper. But the streets knew better. They watched the men who once shouted threats now cross the street when he passed. They saw the young thugs lower their eyes when he spoke, because when power comes dressed in medals and manners, you don't run from it, you bow. Now sleep. Knowing this, every empire needs a place to grow. And for a time, Italy gave Vito Genovese the perfect garden. But gardens don't stay quiet forever. Eventually, the roots reach back across the ocean, and when they do, the real trouble begins. In post-war Italy, the lines between survival and allegiance blurred until they became one and the same. And in the middle of that murky map, all roads, legal and illegal, whispered and screamed, seemed to bend toward one man. Vito Genovese didn't need to chase power anymore. It flowed to him like water downhill. Whether it came from a desperate merchant, a local politician, or a soldier too tired to ask questions, the result was the same. Another debt, another string pulled tight. You didn't have to speak his name out loud to feel his presence. His reach stretched from black market cigarette shipments on the docks of Naples to influence over post-war contracts handed out by men who wore medals instead of holsters. He was no longer a man hiding from his past. He was the future, at least in that strange window between fascism's fall and democracy's fragile rise. What made it more chilling was how natural it looked. Vito didn't roar. He didn't grandstand. He simply made things happen. The mayor got his supplies. The police got their envelopes. The port workers went home fed. And Vito? He got silence, obedience, loyalty born not of love, but of necessity. Even the old world bosses back in New York started to feel it. Messages smuggled across the Atlantic hinted at a coming tide. Names shifted, allegiances wobbled. And in the center of those coded telegrams and whispered phone calls was always one name: Genovese. He didn't need to be in the room. His absence had become his power. He moved like a rumor, untraceable, unquestioned. You'd hear a story about a shipment being protected, or a rival vanishing, and someone would mutter, "Vito's hand." Not as an accusation, as fact. Even the commission, the supposed balance of mafia power, started to lean toward him. From across the ocean, with no official title, Vito became the center of the conversation. If something needed to be approved, they asked what he'd say. If someone needed to disappear, they checked if he'd be offended. The quiet kid from Naples, once dismissed as Lucky's shadow, was now the sun itself. Everything revolved around him, and as he sat on his Italian veranda, sipping espresso and listening to the distant churn of an empire rebuilding, he knew it. He didn't have to knock anymore. Every door was already open, every deal already shaped in his favor, because in a world shattered by war and greed, one man who had learned patience, true, ruthless patience, would always rise first. So close your eyes now and picture the map. Broken cities, scattered men, changing borders, and in the center, a still figure in the dark, waiting, because in the end, all roads lead to Vito, and they always did. Some men play both sides. Vito Genovese didn't just play them, he rewrote the game while they were still setting the board. In the chaos of wartime Italy, where fascist banners fluttered beside black market deals, Vito found opportunity. Not loyalty, not patriotism, opportunity. And he took it with both hands. He had no illusions about Mussolini. The man was a strong man with weak eyes, unable to see who was really pulling strings beneath the marble halls. But Vito saw it. He saw the hunger in the Sicilian underworld, saw the fear in the Axis command, and he made himself useful to both. He whispered to generals about who to trust. He offered information, just enough truth to earn favor, just enough silence to sell later. There were rumors he met with German officers. Others said he kept tabs on Allied movement long before they landed on Italian shores. Some claimed he helped Mussolini purge rivals, not out of ideology, but as a down payment on post-war power. No one could prove any of it, and that was the point. In Sicily, the old bloodlines were stirring. The dons and capos who had been squeezed under the fascists now saw a flicker of freedom in the smoke of bombs. And Vito? He offered them more than escape. He offered them structure, a future, a network that stretched beyond the island, beyond the continent. A promise that the Sicilian name would rise again, not as peasants, but as kings in the shadows. He didn't need to convince them with speeches. He showed them letters from New York. He showed them accounts. He told them about men with suits instead of shotguns who moved millions without lifting a finger. And they listened. Because in a time when every flag felt like a lie, Vito Genovese represented something older, something colder, a power that didn't need borders. The Allies would eventually storm the beaches. Mussolini would fall like an old statue dragged through the streets. But through it all, Vito stood untouched, smiling, watching, ready. They called him many things: collaborator, traitor, survivor. But one word mattered more than the rest: strategist. So now, as you close your eyes, remember this. Some kings rule with thrones, others with tanks, but the most dangerous ones rule with secrets. And Vito? He buried his so deep, you'd need to dig through 2 wars and 1,000 whispers just to glimpse the truth. And even then, you still wouldn't know whose side he was ever really on. Wars are like tides. They shift, crash, and drag away the unready. But for Vito Genovese, the war wasn't a tide, it was a stage. And as the world tipped on its axis, he didn't just stay afloat. He changed costumes, switched lines, became the villain, the ally, the hero, depending on who was watching. By the early years of the Second World War, Vito had threaded himself into the fabric of fascist Italy. He had whispered advice into the right ears, moved black market goods through Allied blockades, and even secured medals from those who thought they understood him. But Vito didn't serve flags. He served opportunity, and when the war began to tip, when the Allies pressed harder, and Mussolini's grip began to sweat, Vito felt it first. He didn't panic. He pivoted. Just like that, the man who had dined with Axis officers became a friend to the Americans. The same hands that had helped fascist logistics now offered intel to the Allies. He painted himself not as a traitor, but as a misunderstood patriot. A man who had always longed for America's victory, but had been forced to play along with the regime to survive. And the Americans? They were desperate. They needed translators, guides, men who understood the terrain and the hearts of southern Italy. Vito gave them all three. He handed over names, routes, enemy weak points. Not all of it was true, but enough was useful. Enough bought him time. In Sicily, word spread fast. The Americans were landing, and behind them came rumors. Genovese is with them. Genovese is coming home. It wasn't official. It didn't need to be. In times of war, whispers carry more weight than newsprint. And so Vito's legend grew, not in bullets or bloodshed, but in reinvention. The Germans saw him as a traitor. The Italians saw him as a survivor. The Americans, some saw him as a partner. Others saw a wolf in borrowed uniform. But by the time anyone tried to untangle his loyalties, he was already packing for New York. The war was ending. But for Vito Genovese, the real battle was only beginning, the one for control, for the crown, for his name carved in stone, not as a shadow behind Lucky, but as the man who stood above them all. Now, rest easy. The bombs have stopped falling, and the uniforms are back in closets. But somewhere, Vito is already drafting the next version of himself, because when the war turned, Vito turned with it, and he never looked back. The truth was never printed in newspapers. It rode in whispers, passed hand to hand like smuggled goods. And during the war, when the United States needed eyes in places too dark to send soldiers, they turned to men who already knew how to live in shadows. Men like Vito Genovese. He wasn't the only one, of course. The Office of Naval Intelligence had begun poking around New York's docks, looking for ways to keep the Axis from slipping saboteurs into American soil. But the unions were thick with silence, and the streets answered to different laws, so someone made a quiet deal. If you want the ports safe, you don't call the mayor. You call the man who already owns the night. They called Lucky first. He was in prison, but still powerful, and he gave them what they needed: protection, access, assurance, and in return, certain hands were untied. Certain sentences were shortened, and through that secret pipeline, Vito Genovese's name surfaced again. He offered more than just help. He offered reach, knowledge, a bridge between the Americans and the underworld in Italy, one that only he could walk. From the black markets of Naples to the cigarette docks in Palermo, Vito knew where the power Saturday, and more importantly, he knew how to move it. Some officers were skeptical, others were thrilled. But in the confusion of war, efficiency won over ethics. If a man like Vito could keep the docks quiet, the supplies moving, the enemies guessing, then what difference did it make how many bodies he'd left in his wake? There were rumors, unproven, but persistent, that mafia figures passed coded messages to Allied commanders, that entire operations in Sicily were aided by locals working under Vito's quiet command, that certain generals looked the other way when his name came up in reports. And Vito? He watched it all unfold with the calm of a man who knew the game better than anyone. He was no patriot. He didn't wave flags, but he understood leverage, and wartime made leverage easier to sell. When the Allies won and Europe began to breathe again, some men returned home with medals, others returned with scars. Vito Genovese returned with options. He had helped the world's most powerful nation win a war. At least that's how he told it. And now, the world would owe him something. Maybe not officially, maybe not on paper, but in the places that mattered. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, Remember this. Sometimes history is not written by heroes or villains. Sometimes it's written by survivors who learned to speak both languages. And Vito? He spoke them fluently. Before a single Allied boot touched Sicilian soil, deals had already been struck in smoky rooms oceans away. Maps were drawn, orders whispered, and somewhere in the blur of uniforms and underworld, the initials OSS met names like Luciano and Genovese. The Office of Strategic Services. America's wartime shadow agency needed more than maps and weather reports. They needed influence. They needed obedience. They needed the kind of control that doesn't come from flags, it comes from fear. And Vito Genovese was fluent in both. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, wasn't just a military maneuver, it was theater. And like any good show, the stage had to be prepared. In New York, naval intelligence leaned into the mafia's grip on the ports. Lucky Luciano, locked up but still whispering through walls, gave the nod. And back in Italy, Vito became more than a fugitive, he became a facilitator. The Allies didn't just land on beaches, they landed in a place already crawling with old vendettas, secret loyalties, and bloodlines that remembered everything. That's where Vito came in. While American officers struggled to win over local support, he knew which doors to knock on, which old men to kiss on both cheeks, which favors to cash in. The mafia, once buried under fascist boots, was now being offered a resurrection, one sanctioned by foreign stars and stripes. It said that leaflets dropped over Sicilian towns carried names and photos of mafia men the Americans wanted to contact, men who could keep the roads open, men who could point out German outposts, men who could control a frightened village better than any tank ever could. And Vito, standing in the shadows of bombed churches and silent vineyards, watched it all come together. He didn't need to wear a uniform to feel the victory. He just needed to be useful. By the time General Patton rolled through Sicily, the mafia was already waiting, not to resist but to welcome. Towns were secured without shots. Bridges were left untouched. And in the quiet, Vito's name slipped between officers like a secret handshake no one dared question. Some historians still argue how much truth sits behind those wartime rumors. But here's what we do know. After the invasion, mafia figures regained power across southern Italy. And Vito Genovese? He was no longer a man in hiding. He was a man with allies in every camp. So now, as the world sleeps and forgets, remember this. Wars are won not just by firepower, but by favors. And when the Allies landed in Sicily, they didn't just bring guns. They brought men like Vito Genovese back into the light. While soldiers crossed oceans and tanks rolled through dust-choked towns, Vito Genovese played a different kind of war game, one that didn't involve bullets, but influence. By the time the Allied forces stormed through Sicily and into mainland Italy, Vito had already positioned himself not as a fugitive, not as a gangster, but as a consultant. Years earlier, he had fled America under pressure, facing charges that could have buried him. But war has a way of rewriting rules. When the Americans needed local cooperation, they didn't reach for clean hands, they reached for useful ones. And few were more useful than Vito. At first, the title was unofficial. But soon, officers began consulting him on who could be trusted, which towns would fold, where fascist loyalty still burned. He didn't wear a badge, didn't salute, but his advice carried weight. His past crimes were quietly ignored. After all, the man could open doors that no general could. Still, the war didn't make him invincible. A Neapolitan court finally caught up to him, and for a brief moment, Vito found himself behind bars in his native country. The charges weren't light murder, blackmail, corruption. But prison, for men like Vito, wasn't always a punishment. Sometimes it was a pause. Inside, he waited, watched, and whispered. He wasn't forgotten. He was protected. American officials, aware of his wartime cooperation, didn't move quickly to condemn him. Italian judges hesitated, sensing invisible hands in the courtroom. And just like that, Key witnesses began disappearing. Some vanished, some simply forgot. The case collapsed. In the chaos of post-war Italy, memory became selective. The man who had once run rackets and silenced rivals was now being quietly escorted out of prison, not in chains, but in suits. He didn't leave with shame. He left with leverage. The irony was thick. A man who had once been hunted by American law enforcement had become a wartime collaborator, a behind-the-scenes fixer, even a shadow diplomat. While others were drafting treaties, Vito was redrawing his empire, this time with a wider reach. The war had changed borders, it had shifted powers, and Vito had shifted with it. So, as you close your eyes tonight, remember that not every prisoner dreams of escape. Some just bide their time until the world needs them again. And when it did, Vito Genovese stepped from his cell not as a convict, but as a man who had survived yet another game of war, and he hadn't even fired a shot. When the dust began to settle after the war, a new kind of battlefield emerged, one without trenches or tanks, but just as dangerous. The United States wasn't done with Italy. They didn't just want to defeat the Axis, they wanted a foothold in the rubble, and standing there, polished shoes planted firmly on Sicilian soil, was Vito Genovese, holding the keys. He had always been a man who traded in loyalty, but now that loyalty had a higher bidder, intelligence officers, diplomats, reconstruction agents, they all knew his name. Some said it with fear, others with quiet respect. But all of them listened, because while the Americans were figuring out post-war Italy with maps and advisors, Vito was already inside the homes, the unions, the markets, the churches. He didn't just know who ran the towns. He knew their cousins, their secrets, their weaknesses. The United States didn't need to build a door into southern Italy. Vito offered to unlock it. Some called it patriotism. Others called it treason in a better suit. But the facts didn't care. Ships moved smoother through ports he touched. Local governments leaned quietly American when he gave the nod. And men who had once toasted Mussolini now suddenly remembered their love for democracy. Vito knew how to flip a country. Not with revolutions, with favors. The arrangement was never written down, never broadcast. But it was understood. He could keep communists out of the docks. He could stop strikes before they started. He could ensure the kind of order that made American investors smile and occupation forces sleep better at night. In return, the old charges vanished into smoke. His crimes, once whispered in both English and Italian, were now labeled alleged. The people who mattered looked the other way, because in a world rebuilding from ashes, sometimes the devil you know makes a better partner than the angels you can't find. And Vito? He played the part well. He wore clean suits, shook foreign hands, smiled for the cameras that never dared capture the blood still on his cuffs. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was an asset. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine this. Not all wars end with surrender. Some just change uniforms. And when the United States looked for a way into post-war Italy, they didn't knock on a government's door. They rang the bell at Villa Genovese, and Vito, always the host, welcomed them in. When the war ended, the newspapers shouted of freedom, victory, and the fall of fascism. Cities lit up, flags waved. But in the quiet shadows just behind all that cheering, another man was celebrating without confetti, without noise. His war had ended too, and he had won. His name was Vito Genovese. While soldiers were returning home with medals and broken hearts, Vito was packing a suitcase, not to run, to return, back to New York, back to unfinished business. The Allies had crushed Mussolini, bombed cities into dust, and restructured Europe. But in doing so, they'd leaned on men like Vito, men who understood how power worked in the cracks. And once those cracks were widened, Vito walked right through them. In Italy, he had traded favors like currency, feeding names to American intelligence, offering stability in towns too broken for governors, making communists vanish before they could organize. His fingerprints were on dozens of quiet deals, so when it came time to settle the accounts, the Americans didn't ask questions. They helped him pack. The murder charge that once loomed over him in New York, the one that sent him fleeing across the Atlantic, that charge mysteriously unraveled. Witnesses had lost their memory. Some had lost their lives. And the court, once so confident, now shrugged. Case dismissed. So Vito came back. But he didn't return a fugitive. He returned a legend. A man who had outlasted indictments, war, exile, and betrayal. He stepped off that ship, not as a suspect, but as a contender. By 1945, New York had changed. The commission was stronger. The 5 families were entrenched. But power, as always, was shifting. And Vito could smell opportunity the way most men smell rain. The war had brought chaos, yes, but also clarity. Vito had survived both the courtroom and the battlefield without lifting a gun. He had gained something most gangsters never did: legitimacy in the eyes of governments. For a man born in Naples and hardened in the alleys of Little Italy, that was a rare kind of coronation. He had learned that real power didn't always wear brass knuckles. Sometimes it wore silk ties and passed intelligence through cigar smoke. And now, the empire he always wanted was no longer a dream. It was an inheritance waiting to be claimed. So, as the Allies celebrated in parades and speeches, Vito Genovese quietly marked the moment in his own way. The war was over, and in its ashes, he had found his crown. When Vito Genovese set foot on American soil again, it wasn't with the swagger of a prodigal son. It was with the cold, calculating stare of a man who knew exactly what had to be done. He wasn't coming home to reminisce. He was coming home to reclaim. New York had shifted in his absence. The old guard was thinning out. Some were dead, some were dying, and the ones still standing, weaker than they used to be. The war had changed everything. Politicians were distracted. The public was tired. The press was looking overseas, and within that silence, the underworld had evolved, but it had not forgotten him. Luciano was gone, exiled to Italy after cutting a deal of his own. The once untouchable boss now watched his empire from across an ocean. Meyer Lansky had his eyes on Cuba. Frank Costello was trying to be a gentleman king, all respect and whispers, but the streets remembered Vito, and the streets wanted muscle. He didn't come back flashy, no parades, no headlines, just a quiet return, one neighborhood at a time, a handshake here, a favor called in there. And slowly, surely, he reminded people of something they'd tried to forget. Power doesn't die just because it leaves the country for a few years. Sometimes it only gets sharper. He took meetings in back rooms and church basements. He listened more than he talked, and when he did speak, it was with the voice of a man who had survived both Mussolini and the Commission without flinching. That kind of survival changes how people look at you. It adds weight to every word. But not everyone welcomed him back. Some feared him, some resented him, and some were smart enough to do both. Because with Vito's return came a feeling one not spoken aloud, but felt deep in the gut. The feeling that balance was shifting, that something ruthless was coming. He didn't demand a throne. He didn't rush to the top. He simply waited. And in that waiting, he watched men unravel. He saw alliances stretch thin. He saw weakness pretending to be strength. And he knew soon, very soon, there would be room at the top again. The world he came back to was not the one he left. But in a way, that made it even better. Because when the rules change, the best player is the one who knows how to rewrite them. Vito Genovese had returned, and the city would never be the same. Frank Costello had the voice of a statesman and the instincts of a street hustler. In the smoky halls of nightclubs and backroom lounges, people called him the Prime Minister of the underworld. While the other bosses played cards and broke knees, Frank played politics. Smooth, calm, always 2 steps ahead, he was the respectable face of organized crime. And for a while, it worked. But not everyone admired the polish. Some mistook it for weakness, and one man in particular saw right through the charm, the tailored suits, and the carefully controlled tone of voice. Vito Genovese. Watching, waiting. Vito didn't interrupt the show. Not yet. He let Frank shine under the lights, let him collect his envelopes and shake hands with senators, let him make peace with unions and buy judges lunch. But in the quiet corners of Brooklyn and the Bronx, Vito was building something colder, something stronger. The kind of empire that didn't need smiles. Every nod Frank got from the commission, Vito counted like a slow-ticking clock. Every favor Costello handed out was another bead of sweat Vito made note of. He could feel the shift in the air. The way the younger men looked at Frank like he was from another era. The way fear had softened into respect. Respect was useful, but it didn't keep men loyal when the knives came out. Frank tried to play it smart. He thought if he let Vito have a seat at the table, the hunger would be satisfied. But Vito never wanted a seat. He wanted the whole room, and so he waited. He waited while Frank built a kingdom on diplomacy. He waited while other bosses forgot how sharp a blade could be. He waited while Frank convinced himself that times had changed, that murder had gone out of style. Vito knew better. Murder never went out of style. It just put on a new coat and learned to smile. The streets whispered, not loudly, just enough to be heard, that Vito was back, that he hadn't lost a step, that the old ways were returning. Not the theatrical violence of the past, but the silent kind. The kind you didn't see until it was too late. Frank Costello ruled, but only for now. Because Vito Genovese was a man who could wait 10 years for a single opportunity, and when it came, he would take it without hesitation. No warning, no ceremony, just one moment, and the crown would fall. In the underworld, silence is a language, and Vito Genovese spoke it fluently. He didn't need banners or speeches. He didn't rally troops in the open or shout about ambition. No, he whispered, softly, patiently. In the dark corners of restaurants, in the back booths of clubs, in parked cars where the windows fogged from quiet breathing and heavier thoughts. That was his campaign trail, not through power, but through pressure. Not through noise, but through nods. Frank Costello sat on the throne, but the shadows had begun to shift. Not all at once, not with loud betrayal, but with doubt, just a flicker in the eyes of lieutenants who used to swear by Frank's way. A hesitation in the voice of a captain handing over numbers. A subtle lean toward the man who wasn't speaking but was always watching. It began with respect. Vito would tip his hat. Smile. Ask about a man's sick mother, his son's wedding, his tax problems. He made you feel seen. Then, as casually as brushing lint off your jacket, he would drop a sentence. Just one. That's not how I'd have done it. No threat, no demand, just a whisper. And it stayed with you. It lodged itself behind your eyes and repeated itself in the quiet moments. Vito knew people better than they knew themselves. He knew who felt underpaid, who felt overlooked, who felt like Frank had grown too friendly with judges and too distant from the street. He offered no promises. He didn't need to. All he did was listen. And remember, he made the forgotten feel important again. He made the angry feel understood. He made the ruthless feel restrained. The whispers spread like smoke, hard to catch, harder to kill. Some of the older guys stayed loyal to Frank. They remembered the bad old days, the bloody days, and they liked how Frank had softened the world. But loyalty fades when fear does. And Vito was patient enough to wait for both to slip away. In a club in Manhattan, a soldier leaned across a table and said, "You hear what Vito's been saying?" He said it like a joke, like a rumor, but his eyes watched every face around him. In Brooklyn, a capo who hadn't taken a stand in 10 years sent a message he was open to talk. In Jersey, envelopes started arriving a little late. Just late enough to signal something was shifting. Frank knew. Of course he did. He could feel it in the way men shook his hand, the way they avoided his eyes. He was still the boss, but the room didn't breathe when he walked in anymore. And Vito? Vito didn't walk in at all. He just made sure the air changed before he arrived. No bullet, no war. Not yet. Just influence. Just a slow turning tide. Luciano had created the commission to avoid chaos. A round table of equals. But every table, no matter how round, eventually finds a sharper edge. Vito didn't want equal. He wanted inevitable. And in the back rooms, in the quiet hours before sunrise, it was becoming exactly that. A done deal that hadn't been done yet. By the time Frank truly understood the depth of the campaign against him, it wasn't a campaign anymore. It was momentum, a weight rolling downhill. And all he could do was try not to get crushed by it. Vito didn't rush. He let it ripen. Every week that passed, Frank's voice got a little softer, his decisions a little slower, his circle a little smaller. And Vito? He just watched, like a man waiting for a tree to fall that he'd been chopping at from the roots. There's a sound the world makes when it's about to change, a stillness, a hum under the floorboards. And in those days, if you listened closely, you could hear it in the clubs, the bars, the street corners. Vito Genovese was coming, not with a bang, not yet, just with whispers. Whispers in the dark. It didn't happen overnight. That's what made it brilliant. That's what made it dangerous. Vito Genovese didn't take power the way a thug kicks down a door. He waited. He watched. And then, when the cracks were wide enough and the silence deep enough, he stepped through like he had always belonged there. Not with a roar, but with a whisper sharp enough to slice skin. Frank Costello had ruled like a gentleman, calm, political. He had turned rackets into businesses, mobsters into quiet millionaires, and the cops into tired, overworked background noise. But every king forgets. Eventually, the throne doesn't respect diplomacy. It respects fear. And Vito, quietly sitting in the background, understood that better than anyone. Patience was his weapon, and poison was his signature. Vito didn't argue with Costello's choices. He just studied them. The charity galas, the golf course handshakes, the soft hands and the softer warnings. Vito nodded, smiled, applauded even. But every time Frank softened, Vito sharpened. Behind the scenes, he started replacing handshakes with whispers, smiles with favors, favors with debts. He made himself useful. He made himself needed. And then, when the time was right, he made himself inevitable. It wasn't just about waiting. It was about pressure. Vito knew where the nerves were. He found the men who felt second tier, who felt passed over, who still had blood in their knuckles and no interest in a polite mob. He found the frustrated and the forgotten, and he didn't give speeches. He just listened. And then he leaned in close and said something like, "If it were me, I'd never forget where you came from." The spout ratter entries, the poison wasn't literal. Not yet. It was spiritual. It was in the way he turned Costello's calm into cowardice, in the way he framed diplomacy as weakness. Vito didn't just attack Frank's body, he attacked his legend. But when that didn't move fast enough, the old tools came off the shelf. It was a Tuesday night when Costello stepped into the lobby of his apartment building. The marble floors echoed with nothing but his own footsteps. A man was waiting. The trigger clicked once. A single shot. It grazed Frank's head. Not a kill, but close enough to make a point. Costello stumbled, bled, survived, and then retired. He knew what the shot meant. It meant that Vito wasn't whispering anymore. The whispers had done their job. Now it was time for silence. The kind that follows when the crown changes hands. The empire that Vito inherited wasn't the same one Luciano had built or Costello had refined. It was colder now, meaner, less interested in politics and more obsessed with absolute control. Vito didn't want peace. He wanted obedience. He didn't want allies. He wanted subjects, and those who didn't fall in line, they didn't last long. The poison spread quick once he was at the top. Old friends found themselves shut out. Deals changed. Envelopes got lighter or heavier. depending on loyalty. The world shifted, and Vito didn't explain it to anyone. He sat behind his desk like a man who had been born there. He barely spoke in meetings, just stared. And men would sweat under that stare, because they knew he had watched them long before they watched him. That was the genius. That was the terror. It wasn't the violence that made Vito different. It was the silence that came before it. And the patience, always the patience. Because long before the bullet flew, long before the seat at the top changed hands, Vito Genovese had already won. He had built his empire not on love or loyalty, but on calculation, on pressure points, on poisoned hearts. And he had all the time in the world to let it rot from the inside out. That was how he ruled. That was how he rose. And nobody saw it coming until it was already done. Lucky Luciano had given Vito Genovese everything: trust, power, and a front row seat to the rebirth of organized crime. They had escaped the chaos of the old world together, carved their way through New York's bloody backrooms, and built a modern syndicate from the bones of old mafiosi. But here's the thing about loyalty in their world: it was only sacred until it became inconvenient. Luciano had always been the visionary, the one who saw beyond the petty street wars and saw structure, profit, diplomacy. He wanted order. Vito wanted control. There's a difference, and it started showing early. At first, Vito played the part. He nodded when Lucky spoke, backed his moves at the commission, enforced rules that weren't his. But deep down, he believed Lucky's soft edge was a flaw. Vito wasn't interested in balance. He didn't want to share. He wanted it all, and he was willing to wait. When Lucky got hit with the prostitution charges, it rocked the whole underworld. Suddenly, the king was exiled, deported back to Italy, 1,000 miles away, out of reach. Lucky still expected his empire to hold together. He thought Vito would guard his throne. He thought wrong. Vito had his own villa now, his own network. He was shaking hands with fascists and funding secret wars while Lucky sat in Naples watching the chessboard from across an ocean. Vito sent letters, made phone calls, promised everything was under control. But behind that calm voice, he was changing the game. He replaced allies with loyalists, moved money without asking, took favors without returning them. And every move he made it look like it was for Lucky. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Luciano, sharp as ever, caught the shift. He started hearing things. Rumors, men whispering about how Vito didn't just want to keep the seat warm, he wanted to smash the chair and build a new one with his own name carved into the back. When Lucky tried to rein him in, Vito played innocent, smiled, sent gifts. But the message was clear. You're over there now. This is my world. It all came to a head when Luciano tried to call in a debt, something small, a request to smooth over a drug shipment. Vito stalled, ignored, then sent word through a third party that the request didn't align with his current priorities. That was it. The final break. Lucky never said it out loud, but he felt the betrayal deep. This was the kid he had pulled from the mud, shaped into a killer, trusted with everything. And now he was watching him rule like a dictator, rewriting the rules they had written together. Vito never apologized, never explained, because to him, there was nothing to explain. In his mind, loyalty wasn't owed forever. It was rented, and when the price went up, you either paid or you were replaced. That's the legacy of Vito Genovese. He didn't break the old guard with violence. He broke them with patience. And when he was done using you, he didn't bury you. He just erased you. Even if your name was Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky understood numbers better than most men understood blood. He didn't need muscle when he had mathematics, leverage, and the sharpness of quiet calculation. Bugsy Siegel, on the other hand, was fire, a spark, with a pistol in one hand and a dream in the other. Between them, they could have built a kingdom that lasted forever. But Vito Genovese didn't believe in shared kingdoms. He watched them from the shadows, always watching, always waiting. Because while Luciano had favored Meyer's brain and Bugsy's flash, Vito favored only one thing: silence. Silence that fell after a threat. Silence that followed a corpse. Silence that spoke louder than loyalty. Meyer knew Vito was a problem. He had always been a problem. Not loud like Bugsy, not brash, but too cold, too calculating. He didn't talk unless he had already made his decision. And by the time you felt the cold breath of danger, he was already behind you, nodding for someone else to pull the trigger. They all saw the future differently. Bugsy saw it in neon lights and desert dreams. Las Vegas, a paradise in the sand. Meyer saw it in offshore accounts, Swiss vaults, silent partnerships. And Vito saw the future in graves. He didn't like Bugsy, said it openly. Too noisy, too impulsive, too American. Vito didn't trust men who smiled too much and dreamed too loud, especially not men who burned through money like fire through dry brush. To Vito, Vegas was a gamble, not an investment, but Meyer kept backing Bugsy, and that made Meyer a liability. Vito started small. Whispers, questions, a missing envelope here, a botched courier there. He planted seeds, then watered them with suggestion. Before long, the East Coast families started asking, where was all that Vegas money going? Was Bugsy skimming? Was he loyal? Meyer tried to protect him, tried to stall, tried to clean up what Bugsy didn't see as a mess, but it wasn't enough. Vito had already sharpened the knives, and they weren't loud knives. They were quiet ones. By the time Bugsy's body hit the floor in Beverly Hills, Vito was already playing innocent, shrugging, blaming others. The kind of blame that spread like ink in water, never clear, never provable, but always there. Meyer never forgot. He never said it, but he knew that behind the execution orders and quiet green lights, behind the reshuffling of Vegas control, behind the smooth transition of casino interests, Vito had left fingerprints. But what could he do? Vito didn't move unless the board was already his. Meyer shifted his operations, pulled back, moved farther into the shadows. But even he, with all his genius, couldn't stop what Vito was building, a new kind of empire. Not built on charm, not on vision, but on fear, precision, and silence. That was the difference. Meyer and Bugsy built things people wanted to see. Vito built things people didn't dare look at. And when the knives came, they didn't flash. They whispered. That was how Vito Genovese won. It was just after dusk when the bullet cracked the evening calm. One shot, meant to kill, missed its mark, but it hit history dead on. Frank Costello, the so-called prime minister of the underworld, staggered but survived. And Vito Genovese, watching from afar, smiled. Because sometimes, you don't need to kill a king. You just need to make him blink. For years, Costello had ruled not with fists, but with finesse. He was a boss who preferred cigars to gunfire, backroom deals to bloodshed. Judges, politicians, business elites. He dined with them all, blending the underworld with the respectable. That was his power. And that was why Vito hated him. Vito didn't want compromise. He wanted control. He had waited, quietly, as always. Let Costello believe the throne was his by right. Let him think the loyalty of men like Albert Anastasia and Meyer Lansky would keep challengers at bay. But Vito knew something deeper. Fear lasts longer than friendship. And Costello, for all his charm, didn't inspire fear. The plan was clean. Vincent Gigante, the chin, would do the job. A rising enforcer, sharp and cold. Vito trusted him to send the message loud and clear. No warnings, no theatrics. Just one shot straight to the head, but the bullet missed. Costello lived. Still, something else died that night, his will. In the hospital, Costello's face said it all. He looked tired. Not from the wound, but from the war he no longer wanted to fight. And Vito, ever the chess player, knew that was enough. Costello stepped back, slowly, publicly. He said it was for his health, for his family. But everyone knew the truth. That bullet had shaken him in ways no court case ever had. It reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, There were still men in this world who didn't play by his rules. Anastasia was furious. He blamed Vito, though there was no proof. There never was. Vito never left fingerprints, only consequences. With Costello out, the old alliances began to fray. Men who once bowed to the Prime Minister now looked to Vito. They saw strength, certainty, a man who would act, not negotiate. And Vito didn't waste time. He filled the vacuum before the body had even healed. Not with words, but with movement. His men took over rackets. His name replaced Costello's in whispers and ledgers. The empire didn't just change hands, it changed shape. Costello retired to quiet corners. He played cards, sipped whiskey, watched the world he once ruled keep spinning without him. Vito never apologized, never explained, because to him, it was simple. One bullet, one moment. You don't always need to kill your enemy. Sometimes, you just need to remind him he can die. Frank Costello didn't step down with drama. No headlines, no gunfire. Just a quiet retreat from a stage he once owned. Like a man folding his cards not out of loss, but out of weariness. He knew what the bullet meant. Even though it didn't take his life, it had taken something else. His illusion of safety, his grip on the throne, and most importantly, his taste for the game. In the days that followed the failed hit, the underworld buzzed not with outrage, but with calculation. Everyone had a question on their mind: would Costello retaliate, or would he walk? And when the answer came, it came softly, like a sigh in the smoke-filled corners of a social club. He walked. He didn't name names. He didn't point fingers. He simply faded, retreating into a life that, while still comfortable, was no longer powerful. No more sit-downs, no more commission meetings. He spent his days playing gin and sipping scotch. The Prime Minister of the mob had become its most silent elder, and that's when Vito Genovese stepped in. He didn't crow, didn't declare. He just moved, filling the space Costello left behind like water settling into a new container. He had waited long enough, years in exile, years biding time. The commission may not have voted on it, but the streets did. The bookies, the enforcers, the capos, they all shifted allegiance, because they saw who held the knife and who took the hit. Vito wasn't like Frank. He wasn't charming. He didn't want to be liked. He wanted to be obeyed. And he was. He tightened the structure, trimmed the fat. Men who had grown soft under Costello's lenient rule were either pushed aside or reminded, in ways that didn't involve second chances, that things had changed. He reshaped the family in his image, disciplined, silent, relentless. But Vito also understood legacy. He didn't erase Costello. He absorbed him. He took his connections, his judges, his unions. He reached into the legitimate world Frank had cultivated and made it bend to his will. What was once influence became leverage. What was once persuasion became pressure. And the commission? It didn't argue, because even those who didn't like Vito respected the simplicity of his rise. No long war, no faction collapse, just one shot, one retreat, and one man standing at the center when the smoke cleared. He began operating like a general, not a negotiator. He opened new channels in Cuba, reached deeper into narcotics. Where Frank had drawn lines, Vito saw borders to be crossed. To him, morality was just strategy dressed in Sunday clothes. By the end of that year, the Genovese name was more than just a family, it was a brand. Cold, methodical, untouchable. Frank still lived, but in name only. He had become a ghost in his own empire, a living monument to what power used to look like. And Vito, who had once been exiled, once been laughed at, now ruled with a hand so firm, even his allies wondered when their turn would come. There were no parades, no speeches, just one man stepping down, and another stepping in. He had waited in the shadows long enough. For decades, Vito Genovese played the long game, smiling when insulted, nodding when passed over, vanishing when the heat rose. But now, there were no more shadows, No more rivals with stronger hands or smoother tongues. The crown didn't fall into his lap. He had pried it loose, one betrayal at a time, until there was no one left with the stomach to stop him. And so, the mob's emperor finally took his throne. It was not a coronation. No music played, no glasses clinked. Just a silent shift in posture across the underworld. Capos stood straighter. Men who had once mocked Vito behind closed doors now chose their words with trembling care. Even allies like Carlo Gambino and Joe Bonanno, powerful in their own right, watched the new king with wary eyes. Because when Vito rose, he didn't just take power, he rewrote the rules. He moved fast, and with precision. The commission, once a council of equals, started to feel more like a court. And Vito sat at the center, not as a mediator like Luciano once had been, but as a monarch. Disputes were still heard, alliances still made, but always in his presence, under his gaze, and by his leave. He wasn't just another boss, he was the boss. His empire stretched from New York to Havana, from the docks of Newark to the alleys of Naples. Narcotics flowed like blood through the veins of every city. Unions bowed, politicians listened, and lawmen looked the other way if they knew what was good for them. And those who didn't, they vanished. Vito didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A glance from him meant more than 100 shouted orders. His style was old world, Roman in its cruelty and precision. He rewarded loyalty lavishly, but punished disobedience with surgical violence. One didn't just cross Genovese. One defied an entire system of fear, and the punishment was never quick. It was studied, designed to echo. He reinstated discipline into the ranks. Meetings were tighter. Money flowed upward like holy tribute. There was no more room for the sloppy or the sentimental. The mob had grown fat on easy rackets and flashy suits. Vito brought back the hunger and the danger. But power did not make him careless. He stayed out of sight, rarely photographed, never quoted. While others chased headlines or posed beside celebrities, Vito watched from the dark, pulling the strings. He had no interest in fame, only obedience. Those who once stood beside him, Luciano, Costello, Anastasia, were gone or silent. And Vito? He was still standing. He had outlasted them all, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most patient, the most ruthless, the most willing to become whatever the moment required. Soldier, exile, diplomat, assassin. Now, he was emperor. And the thing about emperors, they don't retire, they reign. And when they fall, they don't just lose power, they lose everything. There was a moment, a brief, electric stretch of time, when Vito Genovese held more power than any gangster in American history. Not Luciano, not Capone, not even the ghost of Maranzano could touch what Vito had built. It was not just a family, it was an empire, coiled tight around the neck of every industry that mattered. Narcotics, unions, gambling, labor, politics. If it made money or moved people, Vito had a hand on it and a knife behind it. By the late 1950s, the Genovese family wasn't just the most powerful of the 5 families, it was the underworld's spine. And Vito wasn't whispering in ears anymore. He was giving orders, and kings were obeying. His soldiers didn't just walk the streets of New York. They moved through Havana, Naples, Montreal, and Chicago, like they were neighborhoods of one sprawling criminal nation. He built something too big to fit inside city lines. His reach was transatlantic, but Vito didn't care about size. He cared about control. He placed men where they mattered, in the ports, in the garment district, on the docks, inside City Hall, even inside Washington. Not every politician had a price, but enough of them did. And those who didn't could be reminded that accidents happen, brakes fail, boats sink, bullets misfire. While the public imagined gangsters in silk suits and smoky backrooms, Vito had moved the mafia into something colder, more corporate, less visible. The new mob was structured like a machine, and every part turned under his eye. He made sure no one got too big except himself. He crushed insubordination not with anger, but with process. When a capo got greedy or loose-lipped, he didn't yell. He nodded, and someone disappeared. Even his rivals watched their steps. Albert Anastasia had learned that too late. Frank Costello learned it just in time. Carlo Gambino knew better than to test the emperor while the crown still fit. And Meyer Lansky, sharp as he was, preferred to deal from a distance, because even he knew that Vito didn't bluff. At his peak, Vito moved heroin like it was sugar, and no one in law enforcement could tie it to him. They knew he was the brain, the boss, the shadow behind it all. But knowing was not the same as proving. His fingerprints were never found. His name never appeared. He was the ghost that signed no contracts but collected all the money. The American dream, if you dreamed in blood. But the thing about peaks, they're lonely and cold. Vito had climbed over friends, buried rivals, and burned bridges to get to the top. He sat in a mansion, flanked by silence, and ruled over a kingdom of fear. His underbosses admired him. His enemies feared him. But few loved him, because love was weakness, and Vito had none of that left. Still, the peak was his. For a moment, a flash of absolute power, carved from patience, murder, and betrayal. No cameras captured it, no headlines screamed it. But in the quiet of those years, every whisper said the same thing. Vito runs everything. And for a man who had spent his life becoming a myth, that was enough, at least for now. At first, the commission was built on balance. Luciano's vision was one of diplomacy, 5 families sharing power, resolving disputes without endless bloodshed, with a seat at the table for every boss smart enough to stay alive. It wasn't democracy. It was order. The kind that let men like Meyer Lansky make deals across borders and rackets without stepping on each other's throats. But when Vito Genovese took the reins, the temperature in the room changed. Respect was no longer enough. Fear was better. Vito didn't believe in compromise. He believed in control. And the commission, that round table of old alliances and whispered agreements, was about to become a stage for his dominance. The other bosses knew it. They saw it in how Vito spoke, not loud, never loud, but with the steady chill of someone who had waited long enough to stop pretending. He didn't need to raise his voice. His reputation did it for him. The first thing he did was simple: remind everyone what happened to those who stood in his way. Albert Anastasia's murder had sent ripples through the underworld, not just because it was bold, but because it was strategic. The Mad Hatter had ruled with chaos. Vito replaced that chaos with calculation. When he made a move, it wasn't for revenge, it was for position. Now, every time the commission met, it was no longer a gathering of equals. It was an audience with a monarch. Carlo Gambino sat quietly, always 2 steps ahead, but never confronting. Meyer Lansky kept his voice even, his hands clean, but his eyes cautious. Joe Bonanno, always ambitious, tried to smile and nod, but even he felt the shift in air. Vito didn't speak to be heard, he spoke to end discussion. He used the commission the way a spider uses a web, not just to manage the families, but to bind them in obligation, favor, and silence. He restructured influence, placing loyal capos in key cities. He leaned on the unions harder, extracting more cash, more reach. He made deals with foreign operatives, flooded the streets with heroin, and used the commission to bless each move as legitimate. It was no longer a body of judgment, it was a machine of approval for whatever Genovese wanted to do next. And the fear? It worked. No one wanted to cross him. Those who remembered his exile in Italy thought he'd softened. They were wrong. He had just grown more dangerous. Patience had made him sharper, not weaker. And now that he was back, now that he had the crown, he wielded it like a knife. The commission became less of a council and more of a court. One man at the center, the rest orbiting, careful not to drift too far. Vito's version of order wasn't peace, it was silence under threat. A world where everyone knew their lane, and stepping out of it meant disappearing. He didn't need to kill everyone who disagreed with him, just one or two, in plain sight, and then let the legend grow teeth. That was the genius of it. Under Luciano, the mafia had rules. Under Genovese, it had a ruler, and as long as Vito breathed, there would be no vote to change that. It was never supposed to be personal. To Vito, heroin wasn't evil. It was just another product like liquor during Prohibition, numbers in Harlem, or gambling in Havana. Business. Clean in theory, dirty in practice. But the money? It was astronomical. One suitcase of dope moved across the right border could make more than a dozen hijackings. And, unlike labor unions or construction bids, it didn't require deals with politicians, just muscle, silence, and boats. But what Vito underestimated, what all the old bosses underestimated, was how much attention heroin would bring, not just from street cops or local DAs, but from Washington. From the men in suits who saw addiction as a national threat, a rot spreading from the cities outward. They called it an epidemic. For the first time, the mob wasn't just a nuisance. It was a target with a bullseye painted on its chest, and Vito Genovese was standing in the center of it. He had always been smart, ruthless, and a few moves ahead, but heroin changed the game. It made everything faster, more lucrative, and more vulnerable. Junkies talked, couriers got sloppy. The old code of silence didn't mean much when someone was dope sick in a holding cell. Names spilled like blood. Still, Vito pushed forward. He didn't just allow the narcotics trade, he embraced it. He put trusted men on the operation. Ties were strengthened between the American families and the Corsican and Sicilian networks. French ports became gateways. New York became a hub. The pipeline flowed with powder, and the profits came back in bricks of cash. Some in the commission warned him. Some whispered that heroin would bring heat like nothing before. But by then, Vito wasn't listening. Or maybe he was, and simply didn't care. Because when you've waited a lifetime to wear the crown, you don't step back from profit. You double down. He had his fall guys, couriers, soldiers, and lieutenants who'd take the fall if a deal went sideways. He kept his name off anything that smelled like heroin. But no matter how clean his hands appeared, the stink rose. Too many arrests, too many connections. And then there was the biggest mistake of all, trusting the wrong man. His name was Nelson Cantalopes, a mule, a nobody. But the government needed a witness, and Cantalopes gave them one. He testified that he'd run heroin on Genovese's orders, directly. It was flimsy. A word against a myth. But it was enough. In 1958, the king of the underworld stood trial. The courtroom was a cage, not a theater. And this time, Vito had no back door, no bribed juror, no judge on the payroll. The government had found the one crime too ugly for even corrupt insiders to ignore. The verdict came like winter. Guilty, 15 years. A life sentence for a man who had ruled like an emperor. Behind the bars of a federal prison, the myth of Vito Genovese cracked. The man who had silenced cities now lived under the echo of clanging steel and timed lights. He still held influence, still made calls through visitors and notes smuggled in books, but it was different now. Because once you're inside, you're no longer untouchable. And Vito knew it. The narcotics trade had built his empire. It was also what started tearing it down. It started with quiet whispers along the docks of Marseille, passed from sailor to stevedore, from Corsican chemist to Sicilian middleman. The French Connection, they called it, an elegant name for something that turned veins into graveyards. Laboratories tucked behind bakeries, heroin wrapped in cheese shipments. A network so refined it could slip through customs like smoke. It wasn't new, but under Vito's watch, it became industrial. The genius was in the delegation. The Corsicans processed it, the Sicilians moved it, and the Americans made it rain. Vito's men in New York became the conductors of a symphony composed in dope. Couriers flew in with nothing but a prayer and a stomach full of capsules. Truck drivers crossed borders with hidden compartments. The profits were obscene, but so were the stakes. You could trace the path of the drug like a red thread sewn through continents, from poppy fields in Turkey to labs in France, from France to Sicily, from Sicily to Brooklyn, and finally, into Harlem's veins, Detroit's corners, and Chicago's morgues. For every ounce that made it through, a family got paid. For every addict, an empire got stronger. And in the shadows behind it all stood Vito Genovese, watching his influence bloom in poison. But every empire has its cracks, and in this one, the cracks weren't in the pipeline, they were in the men. Trust was always the currency of the mafia, not money. And in the heroin game, that currency devalued fast. A mule gets pinched and sings. A street dealer flips for a lighter sentence. But worse than the small-timers were the ones in suits. The ones who sat at tables with Vito, broke bread with him, kissed his ring, then talked to the feds when the lights went out. There was Carlo, who smiled too much when asked about shipments. There was Tony, who suddenly had a new car and no one knew why. And there were others. Silent traitors. Men who'd rather give up secrets than give up freedom. The heroin money made everyone rich, but it also made everyone suspicious. Paranoia was no longer a sickness. It was policy. By the early 1960s, federal agents had mapped enough of the pipeline to start digging it up. They raided houses in Queens, warehouses in Newark, apartments in Little Italy. Every time they found more: scales, baggies, cut product, ledgers filled with coded names. It all led back to the same names, the same streets, and eventually, the same man. Vito wasn't naive. He saw the heat coming. But what he couldn't predict, what he never prepared for, was the betrayal from inside. Men he'd raised, men he'd trusted with life and liberty. They gave him up piece by piece, not with one big testimony, but with 1,000 little leaks. A sentence here, a nod there, a deal struck in a back office while he sat in a cold cell. The French connection was still running, but the blood it left behind was now American. Addicts in alleyways, kids orphaned by overdose, cities caught in cycles of despair. It was no longer business, it was carnage, and the government finally had its moral high ground. They weren't just fighting crime anymore. They were saving America's soul from men like Genovese. By the time the full scope came into view, it was too late. The empire was built on betrayal, and now it was betraying itself. The same roots that smuggled drugs now smuggled whispers. The same men who laundered money now laundered truth. And at the center of it all, alone in a federal penitentiary, sat Vito, the emperor of a silent war, the architect of an invisible death toll, and the man who thought loyalty could be bought with power. But heroin doesn't make men loyal. It just makes them rich, until it makes them dead. In the heart of Havana, beneath the soft glow of chandeliers and the smoky haze of Cuban cigars, the most powerful gangsters in the world gathered under one roof. The year was 1946, and while the newspapers spoke of post-war peace, another kind of summit was underway. It wasn't politics that brought them here, it was power. American mobsters, Sicilian dons, and Cuban intermediaries circled tables like vultures around a carcass, and at the center of it all, hidden behind cool stares and soft smiles, was Vito Genovese. The Havana Conference was supposed to be a show of unity, a reaffirmation of the Commission's order. But to Vito, it was a stage, and every man there was either a player in his act or a threat to be silenced. He arrived with swagger and calculation, eyes sweeping the Grand Hotel ballroom like a general studying a battlefield. Frank Costello was there, still breathing influence despite the bullet he never took. Lucky Luciano, exiled but not forgotten, sat as a ghostly shadow over the gathering, still pulling strings from Sicily. Meyer Lansky smiled with his usual tight grin, but Vito saw the caution behind it. Every glance was a signal, every toast a test, and every man a possible traitor. To the world, this was about business. about casinos in Cuba, narcotics across the Atlantic, and expanding pipelines that turned poppies into gold. But to Vito, it was about legacy, control, revenge. He didn't just want a seat at the table. He wanted the table flipped in his favor, and anyone who didn't see that would soon feel it. That's when the paranoia started to bleed through the cracks in his charm. He watched the way men huddled in corners. He counted the seconds between smiles and responses. He listened too closely, trusted too little. And when someone laughed a bit too hard, Vito didn't hear amusement, he heard mockery. Even in paradise, he was haunted. He feared Luciano most of all. The man who had built the commission, exiled by the country he once ruled, was still a symbol of balance. But balance wasn't Vito's game. He didn't want shared power. He wanted submission. The idea that Lucky might return, might challenge him, sent tremors down his spine. And so, in whispered conversations with allies who feared him more than they loved him, Vito started laying traps. Some say the Havana Conference ended with handshakes. Others say it ended with silent declarations of war. For Vito, it ended with a decision. No more half measures. From that moment on, the plan was set. Luciano had to be weakened. Lansky had to be watched. And Costello, well, his crown was already slipping. Vito would be the one to catch it. But paranoia is a funny thing. It eats quietly. It chews at reason, then swallows judgment whole. And even as Vito made his plays, called in favors, moved pawns and kings across his criminal chessboard, he couldn't escape the feeling that someone was doing the same to him. He stopped sleeping soundly. He moved with more guards. He started testing his food. He second-guessed old friends. And soon, the empire he wanted so desperately to control began to feel like a prison built by his own hands. Cuba had been the dream freedom from American laws, a gateway to the world, a haven for the underworld. But all Vito saw now were enemies in every reflection. He had built an empire on strategy, but it was being ruled by suspicion. The Havana Conference was over. The cigars were out. The deals were made. But something darker had come home with Vito. A whisper that wouldn't stop. A shadow that wouldn't leave. A thought that looped in his mind like a scratched record. They're coming for me. Even if they weren't, it didn't matter. He'd already decided they were. The irony was sharp. Without Lucky Luciano, there would have been no commission, no order, no system to hold the mob together after the bloody wars of the 1920s. Luciano was the architect, the diplomat, the one who had made the families act less like street gangs and more like nations. But for Vito Genovese, gratitude was never part of the vocabulary. To him, Lucky was not a founder to be honored. He was an obstacle that refused to disappear. And obstacles, Vito believed, were made to be removed. By the late 1940s, Luciano had been deported to Italy, forced to live out his exile in Naples. Officially, he was finished. The United States government had shut the door on him, and the commission had adjusted without him. But exile did not erase influence. Luciano was still the man men whispered about with respect. His voice still reached New York through trusted intermediaries. His presence still made gamblers, bosses, and smugglers hesitate before swearing loyalty to anyone else. And that was exactly what Vito feared. Vito was not a man who liked to share shadows. He wanted all eyes on him, all power consolidated in his hands. Luciano's ghost-like presence undermined that, so the whispers began. Plans hatched in smoky rooms, questions disguised as casual conversation. Wouldn't it be better, safer, cleaner, if Luciano were gone for good? Not just exiled, dead. The idea wasn't outrageous. Luciano had enemies beyond Vito. Some feared his potential return. Others resented his lingering hold. But it was Genovese who pushed hardest, weaving paranoia like a craftsman weaving thread. He painted Luciano as a liability, a man whose ties to both American intelligence and Sicilian factions could destabilize everything. And in Vito's telling, the only remedy for a liability was elimination. Rumors spread of poison slipped into drinks, of shooters waiting in alleys, of dinners arranged with knives behind the smiles. In Naples, Luciano himself began to notice shadows where none should have been. His instincts, honed by decades of survival, told him the danger wasn't from the police or the government anymore. It was from his own family, his own men, from Vito. And yet, Luciano endured. He was not easy prey. He lived cautiously, meeting few, trusting fewer. He carried himself like a man who had already stared down death and refused to blink. More than once, word reached him of plots, an assassin on the way, a shipment laced with poison, a trusted friend turned Judas. Each time, he sidestepped. Each time, he lived. And each time, Vito grew more frustrated. The failed plots revealed something Vito hated to admit. Luciano was still lucky. The same survivor who had outlasted Maranzano, who had navigated alliances with Jewish powerhouses like Lansky and Siegel, who had manipulated judges and policemen with the ease of a maestro conducting a symphony. Killing him was never going to be simple. Luciano didn't just walk with protection, he walked with destiny, but the attempts left a mark. Men talked. Whispers of Genovese's ambition became open suspicion. It was one thing to take down Costello with a single shot. It was another to plot against the very man who had built the house they all lived in. Even those who disliked Luciano respected him, and respect, in the underworld, was often thicker than fear. In time, Luciano made his peace with exile. He leaned into smuggling schemes, heroin pipelines, and quiet deals across Europe and South America. But he never forgot the betrayal. He never forgot that it was Vito who wanted him gone, and he made sure those close to him remembered as well. For every favor, every handshake, there was a warning attached. Watch Vito, he is never finished. And in truth, Luciano was right. Genovese would never stop plotting, never stop cutting at the roots of those who came before him. He couldn't. It was in his blood. To Vito, the past was nothing but a throne lft unwarmed, and Luciano, alive or dead, was still sitting in it. The plot against Luciano failed, but in failing, it revealed more than success ever could. It showed the world the black shape of Vito's ambition. It showed that he would betray anyone, even the man who had once been his shield, his teacher, and his partner. And in the end, it showed that Vito Genovese wasn't just playing for power. He was playing to erase history itself. The board had been cleared, though not by chance. Every piece that once crowded Vito Genovese's rise had been nudged, pushed, or shattered into silence. Bugsy Siegel, the gambler with too much shine and too little discipline, was gone, his body sprawled in a Beverly Hills living room, his dream of Las Vegas bleeding out on the carpet. Lucky Luciano, the founder, the architect of the commission, the man whose name carried more weight than 1,000 soldiers, had been forced into exile in Naples. His influence lingered, yes, but his hands were tied by oceans and politics. And Frank Costello, the diplomat who had once been called the Prime Minister of the Underworld, had chosen retreat over another bullet. One by one, the legends fell away, and in the silence left behind, Vito stood alone. It was not triumph in the traditional sense. There were no parades, no public declarations. The power Vito gained was the kind that did not glitter. It pressed down like iron, invisible, but absolute. He had maneuvered himself into a place no gangster had ever truly reached. For the first time, there was no rival whose voice could drown his, no hand steady enough to balance his ambition, no partnership to bind his power. He was emperor now, but an emperor without equals. The irony was heavy. Vito had once been the quiet lieutenant, the shadow to Lucky's son, the man who waited at the edges until his moment arrived. For decades, he had swallowed insult after insult, exile after exile, playing the long game. But patience is a dangerous seed. When it finally blooms, it does not grow soft, it grows thorns. And now, with the old world erased and the new one trembling. Those thorns were sharp enough to cut anyone who came close. Yet solitude has its price. Luciano's exile did not erase his memory. Men still spoke his name with reverence, especially the older ones who remembered his genius for diplomacy. Siegel's death had not killed his dream either. Las Vegas was still rising, still shimmering in the desert like a mirage of money and sin. And Costello, though retired, was still alive, still breathing in smoky backrooms, his very presence a reminder that not every enemy had been buried. Vito ruled, yes, but he ruled in an atmosphere thick with ghosts, and paranoia crept in. For a man like Vito, isolation was not peace, it was danger. He began to see treachery everywhere. A careless glance became a threat, a late payment, an insult. He doubled the guards, tested his food, kept his circle smaller and smaller, until even allies wondered if loyalty meant safety or if it merely delayed the inevitable. Power had made him untouchable, but it also made him a target. Alone at the top is still alone. Still, he pushed forward. He tightened his grip on narcotics, expanded his reach into unions, and made the Genovese family not just strong, but dominant. Every pipeline of money seemed to flow back to him. Every whisper of defiance was silenced. The empire was efficient, cruel, and terrifying. It mirrored him perfectly, but in quiet moments, behind guarded walls, Vito must have understood the truth. What he had built was not like Luciano's web of balance, nor like Lansky's empire of numbers, nor even like Bugsy's fever dream of casinos. What Vito built was fear, and fear, while powerful, is brittle. It does not inspire loyalty. It inspires silence, and silence cracks the moment someone dares to speak. Bugsy was dead. Luciano was exiled. Costello had stepped aside. For the first time in his long, ruthless life, Vito Genovese stood without rivals, without partners, without peers. The crown was finally his, heavy and cold, and in that silence, he discovered something no one tells you about absolute power. It does not make you invincible. It makes you very, very alone. It was supposed to be a triumph, the moment when Vito Genovese could step out of the shadows and show the world that he was not just another boss, but the boss. For years he had whispered, plotted, maneuvered, and cut down rivals until no one could doubt the reach of his hand. Now he wanted recognition, respect carved in stone, authority that no man could question. And so, in the fall of 1957, he called for a meeting. Not just any meeting, a gathering of the commission itself, a summit of every major mafia leader in America, held in a quiet upstate town called Appalachian. The location was chosen for its seclusion, a sprawling estate in the rolling hills of New York State owned by one of Joe Barbara's men. It was meant to be discreet, invisible to outsiders, a countryside retreat far from the noise of the city. 100 cars rolled into that little town over the course of hours, Cadillacs and Lincolns lining the driveway like a parade of power. From Chicago came men loyal to Sam Giancana. From Buffalo came Stefano Magaddino. From New Jersey, from Detroit, from Cleveland, they all came. Even some Sicilian faces appeared, men who traveled oceans to sit in the presence of the new emperor. Nearly every family sent representatives. It was supposed to be the final stamp of legitimacy on Genovese's reign, but hubris is a dangerous companion. The very size of the gathering made it impossible to ignore. The townspeople noticed. Gas stations filled with strangers in expensive suits, restaurants serving steak dinners to men who spoke in whispers and carried themselves with authority. Neighbors called the police, curious about the sudden influx of luxury cars in a sleepy village where a new Cadillac was as rare as a shooting star. To the locals, something felt wrong. To law enforcement, it felt like an opportunity. As the bosses gathered inside, sipping coffee and discussing narcotics routes, union infiltration, and Cuban casino deals, state troopers were already setting up roadblocks. The word spread fast. Something big was happening in Appalachian, and then it broke. Sirens, officers swarming the estate, panic erupted inside the mansion. These men, who controlled cities with a phone call and ended lives with a glance, scrambled like startled animals. Some fled into the woods, others dove into cars, desperate to escape. Shoes were lost in mud, suits torn by branches, hats left behind in the chaos. It was a farce, and the newspapers would later devour it. Dozens were caught, dozens more barely escaped. And though many charges didn't stick, the damage was done. For decades, the mafia had been an open secret, whispered about but never confirmed. After Appalachian, there was no denying it. Headlines across the country blared the truth. There was a national crime syndicate, organized, structured, and now exposed. The government had its proof. And the man who had demanded the meeting, who had insisted on the spectacle, was the very man who suffered most from it. Vito had wanted to show his strength. Instead, he revealed the mob's hand. His hunger for recognition had torn down the curtain of secrecy that men like Lansky and Luciano had spent years carefully weaving. To them, discretion was survival. To Vito, silence felt too much like disrespect, and so he chose spectacle. But spectacle is sloppy. Spectacle leaves footprints. Spectacle gets noticed. When the dust settled, Vito still sat at the top, but his image was cracked. Some whispered that he had overplayed his hand, that a true boss never invites that kind of attention. Others saw the arrests, the indictments, the photographs splashed in newspapers, and they began to wonder if following him was worth the risk. Even inside prison walls, Luciano smirked at the news. From Sicily, he heard of the fiasco and knew immediately Vito had exposed them all because he couldn't resist being seen. The Appalachian meeting was meant to crown an emperor. Instead, it branded him with arrogance. And while the commission continued, while the rackets carried on, the shadow of that day in the hills lingered. For the first time, the law had pierced the veil, and for the first time, men began to doubt that Genovese's empire was built to last. The hubris of Appalachian did not kill Vito outright, but it planted the seed of suspicion, the seed of downfall. Because once the world sees you bleed, it will never stop watching for more. When the dust of Appalachian settled, it did more than embarrass the mob. It changed the way the government looked at organized crime. Before that day in the hills, the FBI had treated the mafia like a rumor, something whispered in newspapers and spoken about in courtrooms but never truly acknowledged. J. Edgar Hoover himself had long dismissed it, preferring to chase bank robbers, kidnappers, and communists. But photographs of dozens of well-dressed men fleeing through the woods of upstate New York forced the truth into the daylight. And suddenly, Hoover's bureau had a new obsession. Vito Genovese had wanted recognition. He got it, but not in the way he dreamed. Overnight, his name became shorthand for the mob's shadow government. The FBI began collecting files, thick folders filled with surveillance notes, informant whispers, and financial ledgers. Wiretaps were approved, phone lines tapped, clubhouses watched. The bureau, which once barely had an Italian-speaking agent, now scrambled to build entire squads dedicated to dissecting the world Vito had ruled with silence. For Hoover, it was personal. He hated being embarrassed, and Appalachian had embarrassed him on the national stage. Senators grilled him, newspapers mocked him. Citizens wondered how the most powerful law enforcement agency in America could be so blind to what was clearly happening under their noses. Hoover, proud and vindictive, turned his fury into focus. And the bullseye he painted was aimed squarely at Vito. Agents followed Genovese's men into restaurants, bars, and union halls. License plate numbers were written down, bank accounts scrutinized. The Bureau began building webs names connected to numbers, numbers connected to businesses, businesses connected to drugs. Where before the mob had enjoyed the luxury of anonymity, now every move was shadowed by men in dark suits taking photographs from parked cars. Vito, for his part, pretended it did not matter. He carried himself with the same cold authority, holding court in smoky backrooms, directing narcotics routes, and tightening his grip on unions. But even he could feel it, the weight of eyes always watching. He tested his phones, changed his cars, rotated his guards. Paranoia was no longer just a strategy. It became daily life. The Bureau wasn't perfect. They still struggled to crack the code of omerta, the iron silence that kept soldiers from speaking. Informants were rare, and those who did talk often ended up dead before they could testify. But the Bureau was patient, and patience was something Vito usually owned. Now he faced an enemy, willing to match him in waiting. And when the narcotics cases began to pile up, when witnesses like Nelson Cantalop stepped forward, the FBI finally had what it needed. Genovese's own empire, bloated with heroin profits, was also leaking information. Couriers and street dealers, desperate for leniency, gave up names. Wiretaps caught half-spoken instructions, fragments of conversations that prosecutors stitched together into chains strong enough to hold even a man like Vito. What made the obsession different was that it never stopped with him. The Bureau's files expanded outward, covering every family, every boss, every soldier of note. Appalachian had cracked the myth of invisibility. Now the mob was not just an underworld rumor, it was a federal target. And Vito Genovese, sitting at the top, bore the full weight of that spotlight. For the rest of his life, he would never know a day without federal eyes on him. Every phone call might be tapped, every meeting might be watched, every move might be the one that brought the indictment. He had wanted to be the emperor of the mob. He had achieved it. But emperors, history reminds us, are always the ones remembered by their enemies. And in the FBI, Vito had found an enemy that would outlive him. The Bureau's obsession would not only shape his downfall, it would shape the very future of organized crime in America. Because from the moment those agents saw him stumble into the trap of Appalachian, they vowed never to let the mob hide in shadows again. The fall of Vito Genovese did not come in a blaze of bullets or a sudden betrayal on a darkened street. It came slow, methodical, wrapped in the patient net of law enforcement and the greed of men he thought he owned. For years, he had built his empire on narcotics, brushing off the warnings of men like Frank Costello, who called heroin too hot, too dangerous. To Vito, it was just numbers, profit, and profit was all that mattered. But what he could not control was the weakness of those beneath him, the ones who carried the powder in their pockets, who sweated under interrogation lamps, who traded loyalty for a lighter sentence. The trap began with whispers. A courier pinched in Harlem, an underboss questioned in Newark, a dealer caught with bricks of heroin in Queens. Each one swore silence at first, clinging to omerta, the code of silence that had kept the mafia alive for generations. But heroin has a way of eroding codes. Addicts turned informant. Small-time pushers sang for protection. And soon the government had a name, repeated too often to ignore: Vito. The Bureau needed more than whispers. They needed a witness who could stand in court and point to the emperor without trembling. They found him in Nelson Cantalop's, a mule who had ferried heroin for Genovese's men and lived to tell about it. Cantalop's was no soldier, no made man. He was a hustler, a courier, the kind of disposable figure bosses never worried about. But in the hands of federal prosecutors, he became the sword aimed at Vito's chest. Cantalop's testified that he had moved shipments under direct orders from Genovese's lieutenants. He painted a picture of a network so large it stretched from Corsican labs to American streets, with Vito's hand steady on the lever. The defense scoffed. They called him a liar, a desperate man fabricating stories to save himself. But the government didn't rely on his word alone. They had tapped phones, seized ledgers, tracked couriers. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and every piece pointed back to the same man. Vito felt the walls closing in but refused to believe they could touch him. For decades, he had slipped through every net, bribed every official, bent every rule. He had survived exile, assassination attempts, and betrayal. He believed he was untouchable. Even in court, sitting in his tailored suit, he carried himself like a man presiding over others, not a man fighting for his freedom. He glared at witnesses. He whispered to his lawyers. He acted as though the verdict were already bought and paid for. But this time, it wasn't. The jury returned with one word that changed everything: guilty. Vito Genovese, the emperor of the mob, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for narcotics trafficking. The courtroom buzzed with shock. Some could not believe that a man so careful, so disciplined, could be brought down by something as flimsy as a courier's testimony. Others nodded, whispering that it was inevitable, that no empire built on poison could last forever. Inside the prison walls, Vito still tried to rule. He sent messages through visitors, scribbled notes on scraps of paper, used coded phrases on monitored calls. For a time, he managed to keep influence alive. Orders were given, money still flowed, rivals were kept in check. But prison is not the same as the streets. Every message was slower, every command filtered, and every day he spent inside, the empire outside learned to breathe without him. The betrayal stung more than the sentence. Vito had always believed fear was stronger than loyalty. He was right, but only up to a point. Fear kept men silent until survival demanded otherwise. Then even the most loyal lips loosened. In the end, it wasn't courage that destroyed him. It was cowardice, the natural instinct of men who valued their own skin more than their boss's empire. The trap had been set with patience. It had been sprung with betrayal. And for the first time in his long, ruthless life, Vito Genovese found himself caged not by rivals, not by bullets, but by the very system he had mocked as weak. The emperor had walked straight into the snare, and the door slammed shut. In the end, it wasn't a rival boss, a hail of bullets, or a bloody coup that brought down Vito Genovese. It was a man no one in the underworld had ever taken seriously, a hustler who should have been forgotten as quickly as he was used. His name was Nelson Cantelops, and history remembers him as the rat who toppled an empire. Cantelops was not a made man. He wasn't even close. He was a courier, a mule who carried heroin in his stomach and in false-bottomed suitcases. A man whose entire existence was defined by being expendable. In the mafia's eyes, he was nothing more than a cog in a massive machine, someone who could vanish tomorrow without changing the gears. But what no one realized, not even Vito himself, was that in a system built on silence, one weak cog could make the entire engine seize. When federal agents squeezed Cantelops, they expected scraps. Instead, he gave them names, dates, meetings, instructions, and most importantly, a direct line pointing back to the emperor himself. He testified that Vito had personally overseen narcotics deals, that shipments had been moved under his authority, that he had been at the heart of an international pipeline stretching from Corsica to Harlem. It was the kind of testimony law enforcement had dreamed of for decades, and now it had fallen into their lap from the mouth of a man Vito had thought too small to notice. In court, Genovese sat with his usual icy calm. He looked at Cantelops as though staring at a bug on the wall, beneath notice, beneath contempt. His lawyers tore at the testimony, calling him a liar, a drug addict, a desperate man clinging to a deal that would keep him out of prison. And in truth, Cantelops was all those things. But what mattered wasn't whether he was pure. What mattered was whether he was useful. And to the government, he was more useful than gold. The jury didn't see a perfect witness. They saw a man who knew too much, who described details only an insider could know. They saw ledgers, wiretaps, and arrests that matched his words. And in the end, they saw the pattern the prosecutors wanted them to see. Vito Genovese, as the architect of America's heroin plague. The verdict shattered the myth. For years, Vito had seemed untouchable, a ghost who ordered deaths and collected fortunes without leaving a single fingerprint. But now, the emperor was caged, sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, his empire left to scramble without him. The underworld whispered in disbelief. Could it really be that a courier, a nobody, had undone the most powerful mobster in the nation? Vito never accepted it. In his mind, Cantaloupe was a pawn, a tool of rivals and lawmen who envied his power. He swore revenge, even from behind bars, but the truth was harsher. It wasn't just Cantaloupe who had betrayed him. It was the entire system of fear he had built. Fear had kept his men loyal only until they saw a chance to save themselves. Then silence crumbled, omerta cracked, and one man's voice became the hammer that broke the crown. For the rest of his life, Vito cursed the rat who had done what Luciano, Costello, and even the government itself had failed to do for decades. Nelson Cantaloupe did not live long after the trial. Betrayal has its costs, but his words outlived him. They carved a hole in the empire Genovese had spent a lifetime building, and so the man who once ruled like an emperor learned the oldest truth of power. It doesn't always take an equal to bring you down. Sometimes, it only takes a voice from the gutter, speaking at the right time, in the right courtroom, under the right light. The rat had squeaked, and the empire fell. Prison walls were supposed to end Vito Genovese. That was the government's hope, the dream of prosecutors who had watched him slip through their fingers too many times before. They thought concrete, steel, and guards would cage the emperor and leave his empire to rot in his absence. But they misunderstood the man. Vito had never ruled with his hands. He had ruled with his mind, with whispers, with the kind of fear that seeps through cracks no bars can contain. So when the gates closed behind him in the late 1950s, Vito did not stop being a boss. He simply learned to rule from the inside. The penitentiary became his palace of stone. Other inmates, hardened criminals who thought themselves untouchable, gave him space in the yard. Guards, tempted by envelopes, stuffed with cash or terrified of what would happen if they refused, smuggled in notes, relayed orders, and looked the other way. Even behind bars, Vito had soldiers on the outside who moved his will like shadows across the city streets. A single word passed through a visitor could become a death sentence. A nod from him during a visitation could shift rackets, reroute shipments, or decide who rose and who vanished. For a time, his power held steady. The Genovese family operated as though nothing had changed. Capos collected money, racketeers kept the unions locked tight, and the heroin trade still flowed. Men visited him with tribute, the way senators once knelt before emperors in Rome. Prison did not diminish his aura, it intensified it. To many, it proved that he was invincible, that even the government's strongest chains could not break him. But the truth was more complicated. Inside those walls, Vito had less room to maneuver. Every message took longer, every order risked interception. And most dangerous of all, every ambitious underboss knew that time was now their ally. Carlo Gambino, quiet and patient, grew stronger with each passing year. Others, too, men who once bowed without question, began to test the limits of their obedience. Still, Vito fought to remain the emperor. He hosted meetings in visiting rooms, speaking in riddles and codes that only his most trusted could interpret. He punished disloyalty swiftly, making examples out of anyone foolish enough to test him. Inmates whispered that men who crossed Genovese on the outside somehow ended up dead, even though their boss never left his cell. The message was clear. Vito's reach did not stop at the prison gates, yet age was catching him. The years inside weighed heavier than the years outside. His health faltered, his temper grew shorter, and the paranoia that had long guided him began to eat away at him more openly. He trusted fewer men. He suspected betrayal in every delay, every missed payment, every failed courier. In his mind, the empire was still his, but in reality, the world outside was shifting. Quiet deals were being made without his blessing. Decisions were being shaped by younger bosses with sharper eyes on the future. To the public, he was a caged king. To law enforcement, he was finally cornered. But to the underworld, he was still Vito Genovese, the man who could make or break fortunes with a look, the man whose silence carried more weight than another's orders shouted. His name was still spoken carefully, even reverently, by men who had never met him but lived in the shadow of his decisions. In prison, Vito proved something few bosses ever could. Power wasn't about where you Saturday. It wasn't about freedom of movement or luxury or the illusion of untouchability. Real power was the kind that survived bars, guards, and wire fences. Real power was the kind that could still make men tremble in a visiting room, decades into a sentence. He was still a boss, just a boss in bars. And for Vito, that was enough to remind the world that even caged emperors cast long shadows. The cell was small, the walls gray, the air heavy with the weight of time. Vito Genovese, once the emperor of the underworld, lay on a thin prison mattress that creaked with every shift of his aging body. To an outsider, he was just another inmate, another number in a federal registry. But to those who whispered in corners and remembered the old days, he was still the man who had bent cities to his will. Yet here, in this narrow cage, the emperor slept, and even in sleep there was no peace. The nights were the hardest. He would drift off, but not into rest. His dreams were not gentle. They were crowded with the faces of men he had trusted and betrayed, men who had died because his voice had demanded it. Bugsy Siegel's grin, Luciano's cold stare, Costello's tired eyes, Anastasia's rage, each of them appeared in the dark, not as ghosts seeking vengeance, but as reminders that his throne had been built on shifting bones. He woke often, breathing heavy, eyes darting to the corners of the cell as if the walls themselves were plotting against him. Sleep offered no escape. In dreams, he was back in Naples, walking with Mussolini's men, blood on his hands that no metal could hide. Or he was in Havana, scanning faces at the conference, convinced every smile was a dagger. Or he was in Appalachian, watching the empire stumble into daylight as cops swarmed like vultures. Each memory returned like a punishment, looping until he stirred awake, sweating under the thin blanket. The guards noticed. The once proud boss now muttered in his sleep, sometimes shouting in Italian, other times whispering names no one recognized. He barked orders to shadows. He cursed invisible traitors, and when dawn came he carried himself with the same old authority, though his eyes betrayed the truth. The emperor had not rested. In the daytime, he clung to the fragments of his power. He held court in the visiting room, directed business through scraps of paper and coded messages. But night always stripped away the facade. Alone in the cell, stripped of soldiers and lieutenants, he was just a man waiting for the end. The weight of his own paranoia pressed harder than any guard's baton. For Vito, peace had never been an option. He had built his life on betrayal, on fear, on the kind of silence that kills louder than a bullet. That sort of life doesn't allow for gentle sleep. Every choice he had made carved deeper into his conscience, whether he admitted it aloud or not. And in prison, with time slowed and distractions few, those choices came back like uninvited guests. By the late 1960s, his health was failing. His body, once iron, began to betray him. His mind, once sharp enough to play a dozen moves ahead, began to dull. But his pride never left. Even as other inmates saw him as an old man in a cell, he carried himself like royalty. He refused to bend, refused to admit defeat. Yet the truth lingered in every restless night. The emperor was tired. In February of 1969, Vito Genovese died in a federal prison hospital bed. The official cause was a heart attack, but those who had known him whispered that his heart had been breaking for years, worn down by the weight of paranoia and the endless replay of his own sins. He left behind no speeches, no apologies, no confessions, just silence. The same silence he had always wielded like a weapon. The emperor slept at last, but not peacefully, because men like Vito never truly rest. Their shadows keep walking long after their bodies are gone. Their whispers linger in alleyways and bars, in courtrooms and history books. Vito Genovese may have died behind bars, but his ghost still sits at the head of a table, only he believed was his alone, and maybe that is the final truth of his life. Power can be stolen, fear can be manufactured, empires can be built, but peace? Peace never belonged to men like Vito. Not in life, not in death, not even in dreams.